Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. It's 9 o'clock now. Just wanted to let you all know that it looks like we still have a number of people logging in, so we'll just give it a couple more minutes. We'll probably be getting started at like 9:02, 9:03. So thank you very much for being here on time, and we'll be getting started in just a moment. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for our Favorite Plants of Inland Valley Gardens workshop. My name is Scott Kleinrock. I am the Conservation Programs Manager at the Waterwise Community Center, and we're going to be getting started. Quick note before we get into it, we're going to be going over a lot of information today, a lot of plants, a lot of information about plants. I encourage you to take notes if you want to, but all of this content will be available to you afterwards. So immediately after the workshop, what I'm going to do is post a single PDF file of each of the slides in this presentation today. And you will be able to get that at this web address right here, cbwcd.org/presentations. That's cbwcd.org/presentations. And I'm typing that in the chat right now, just in case you don't have a pen in front of you right now, you'll be able to go back into the chat and see that. And so on that site, basically, that's where I post the PDFs of all of the workshops that we've taught recently. So the most recent ones always go up to the top, and basically it's going to be a large download file. So depending on your browser, the easiest way to get it usually is to right click and do something like, it'll say save linked file as. If you just click on it on most browsers, it'll try to launch the entire PDF into the web browser. If that happens, it's not that big of a deal. It'll just take a number of minutes to load on most computers because of the file size. And then you can generally go to File, Save As, or something like that, and save that file as well. We're also recording this today. And after some light editing of the downtime at the beginning, This will be available to rewatch at cbwcd.org/YouTube. That brings you directly to our YouTube playlist of all of our past online workshop recordings. There's a lot of great content there. I encourage you to check it out. Just a note though, it'll probably be about a week before that gets up on there, because immediately after this workshop, I'm going to be on vacation for a number of days. So in the meantime, feel free to check out the other videos there. There is a recording of a past version of this workshop there, and then this actual recording will probably be up by this time next week. Before we get started, for those of you who have not joined us for past workshops, I'm going to briefly tell you a little bit about the agency that I am from. We are the Waterwise Community Center. Our formal name of our agency is the Chino Basin Water Conservation District. We are a small public agency, technically a special district, so similar in terms of like a school district or a fire district. We're much smaller than most of those, and we're created by a public vote in 1949, providing water conservation services to basically the western edge of San Bernardino County. We don't provide drinking water to anybody. We provide water conservation. So we work very closely with our local water providers on water conservation efforts. And our mission is kind of threefold. We say that we're here to demonstrate, educate, and percolate. So percolation, like you can see here on the right, has long been our agency's kind of bread and butter. We maintain and operate in coordination with some other local water agencies a number of large-scale, what are called infiltration basins. This is a picture of one of them, literally an old gravel pit in the area, which had since been re-engineered to take water in from the channelized storm drains in the area where the water would otherwise leave the community as runoff in storm events, and through natural processes to clean and use that water to recharge our local groundwater table to be available later for local use, to use as much of our own water in our communities as possible. And that's kind of how our agency contributes to the supply side of water conservation. But on the demand side, we also want to work to make sure that water is being used wisely in our communities and that we're really getting something for the resources that we're using. And in our local communities, about 60% of our water supply is used in our urban areas, outdoor in the landscape. So the team that I work with focuses on outdoor landscape conservation through a couple of different methods. We have an outdoor demonstration garden, about 3 acres of demonstration of water-wise plants and techniques. A lot of the stuff we're going to talk about today. Unfortunately, due to COVID, our facility is closed to the public right now, but we look forward to getting that back open as soon as possible. Normally, it's open 6 days a week, every day except Sunday at our headquarters in Montclair, California, just off the 10 freeway. And it's free and open 6 days a week. We also do a lot of education for different groups, everything from K through 12 curriculum, integrated education, to working with college interns, to one-on-one programs, as well as online workshops like this for our community members. And we also do training for landscape professionals. The easiest way to stay in touch with us and to keep up with all of our free programs and workshops is to sign up for our newsletter. I'm typing the link in the chat right now. And you'll just get 1 email a month, keeping you up to date with everything we have going on. So before we jump into the main content, I figure I should tell you a little bit about who I am and why I'm even talking to you about this. And then I'll ask you to do the same with a quick poll. So like I said, my name is Scott Kleinrock. I'm the Conservation Programs Manager at the Waterwise Community Center. I've spent about the last 16 years now really sort of obsessed, both in my professional, academic, and my personal life, with figuring out how we can, I guess, collectively do better with our landscapes in Southern California. And all of that work has been in inland valley situations. I was born and raised in the San Fernando Valley, Los Angeles, very similar climate to the San Gabriel Valley, where I later worked, to the Pomona Valley, where I went to school, and to the kind of Pomona Valley into the greater Inland Empire, where I now work. So very similar gardening kind of horticulture conditions through all of that. And I've done everything in the field from landscape maintenance to horticultural management, kind of maintenance oversight, project management, and landscape construction, and also studied landscape architecture and practiced landscape design. And so I like to tell people that I've learned about plants and all the plants that I'm going to talk to you about today, because not only have I used them, but I've also used a lot of them in the wrong way. I've killed a lot of plants in the last 16 years, and I've learned a lot from all of those mistakes, really figuring out how things tend to work where we are. Every site's different, so that's part of the challenge and part of the fun of it. But everything that I'm going to talk to you about today is really based on experience, not just kind of repeating something that I read in a book. For those of you who are joining us from maybe more coastal areas, all of the plants we're going to talk about today are still going to work for you. You might just be able to get away with a little bit more sun exposure in some of the areas that are, I say, kind of part shade for inland, maybe water a little bit less. So we're focusing this on plants for inland gardens. But for those of you in more moderate coastal areas, this will all work as well. And so with that, I am going to launch a very quick poll. If you can all please just click on the answers that apply for these few questions. That gets me some metric data for the tracking that we do for our programs. And then also the last couple of questions really provides me with some great information, especially about what kind of plants you currently have, about where we're starting as you think about maybe new plants to add into your gardens at home. So I'll give just about a minute for that, and then we'll jump into the main presentation. So I see some of you are starting to be finished. Thank you very much. For those of you who are in other areas in terms of where you live, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. Please let us know in the chat where you are. It helps me know kind of the geographical distribution of who's joining us, which is very helpful. Oh no, I see that there is an error in the poll where it's only letting people answer a single choice. I'm sorry about that. Must have set that up incorrectly, which sometimes happens. So don't worry about that if that's giving you grief. So give just another moment for people to finish up. See that for a little over half of you, it's your first time joining us. So thank you very much. And yeah, please sign up for our newsletter. And if you like what you learned today, join us for future programs. A lot of you are in our local service area: Chino, Chino Hills, Ontario, Montclair, Upland, Rancho Cucamonga, or Fontana. And a number of you pretty even split between Los Angeles County, Riverside County, and other places where we have people joining us from Ventura, Laguna Niguel, so a little more coastal, Claremont locally, Sun City, West Covina, up in the Bay Area, welcome, Fresno. Thank you for letting us know who you found out about this from. Some local people: Ontario, San Diego, San Gabriel Valley, Bay Area. Awesome. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for letting us know how you found out about the workshop. And fortunately, we'll skip the last question because, yeah, the poll was giving us some issues. Okay. So a quick note about how to interact with me throughout this workshop and ask questions, which I welcome you to do. I don't actually, like in some Zoom meetings or webinars, people raise their hand and they'll be called on. We don't actually do that with our workshops because with the relatively large attendance, we have 39 people with us right now. There's a lot of downtime with the audio and video and technical issues with that. So the best way to interact with me is to type your questions into the Q&A function. So in your Zoom interface, you'll see a little button that says Q&A with a couple of chat bubbles. You can click that to open it at any time and type in your question. I keep an eye on all of those as they're coming in. And as I transition between sections, I will take a moment to answer all the questions that have come in. Feel free to type in any question that you have. And what I generally do is to keep the presentation kind of flowing. The questions that I'll answer as I stop between sections are the questions relevant to kind of what we're talking about at the time. Sometimes people have more personal questions, which are kind of like, I have this situation in my yard, where the answer is really mostly applies to you. I'm happy to answer all of those questions, but sometimes I'll need to save those for the end of the workshop because we get a lot of them and I wouldn't be able to get through all the content in the time period if I answer all of those. So if you have time, I might hold some of those questions towards the end and then I'll get through all of them, definitely. If you have other just general comments or anything like that that you want to share, feel free to type those into the chat as well. But for questions, I am more likely to see them if you type them into the Q&A function. And so with that, let's start by looking at a few pictures. So as we kind of together as a society search for where to go from here with what we do with our landscapes in California, it's kind of become the Wild West. And it's getting a little bit better, but especially like 5 years ago or so, it was starting to look like maybe landscapes like this were starting to become the default when well-intentioned people were tearing up their lawns and wanting to put in something that was going to take less water. And I don't show this picture to, by any means, make fun of the person who put in this landscape, but it became very clear for a lot of us who were interested in this that it's not necessarily as simple as it used to be, where there was just a couple of landscape types, especially for front yards, that people would put in. And as I was seeing what was happening, I started to be thinking, what will become the new default? Because certainly we don't want it to necessarily be wall-to-wall gravel and a few little plants trying to survive in that heat. And so our first big idea before we start talking about individual plants is that evolving to a low water landscape is not a compromise. And in fact, there are so many amazing plants that we can grow in Southern California that chances are you can end up with a landscape, and definitely you can if you kind of think through the design, where you're going to be using less resources, less time overall. The maintenance that needs to be happening is going to be much more enjoyable, and our landscapes will give us so much more beauty, so much more habitat for things like butterflies and songbirds that we're really going to get a lot more out of it in the long run. It's by no means a compromise. And so here's just a few examples of residential gardens throughout our local valley areas that I've taken pictures of over the year, from pretty simple landscapes with manzanita and deergrass being the main plants here, to ones that are a little bit more rambunctious, still very beautiful with lots of color. It's kind of like a mostly California native, almost chaparral inspired landscape. Mixes of true desert plants, cactus with tough but beautiful California native shrubs. Or landscapes that just emulate, for example, this fancy landscape designed by landscape architect Bernard Trainer, just emulate a natural native oak woodland. So simple, but lovely and elegant. They can be very carefully designed, or they could be much more informal. But even this very informal kind of wild looking front yard is still a much nicer place to sit and enjoy the day than vast majority of front yard, just kind of lawn and a couple of roses landscape. If you're ambitious and you want to rip out a whole lawn or plant a whole yard to the kind of landscape that you're thinking about, kind of new one, then that's great. But it's also just fine to start small with a few plants, kind of taking away some turf at the edges or just replanting a planter where you're ready to refresh it. Start small and kind of gain confidence. And even when you're ready to do something bigger, if you still have a use for your lawn, if you want a small patch of lawn for your dog, if you have a kid who's learning to play soccer, there are uses for them. So what I encourage people to think about is how much turf do you use or do you want to use? And maybe you can do something that takes less water, less resources, no fertilizer, and is much more beautiful and exciting in the rest of the area. So that kind of sets us up for today's workshop. We're really going to be talking about plants. Here's kind of our outline. We're going to go through a very brief introduction to California native and water-wise plants, how to think about plants for your garden and where to research plants. And then the vast majority of the time we have here today is going to go through some of my favorite plants for Inland Valley home gardens. And we'll briefly cover where to get some of these awesome plants and just a bit about bringing it all together and next steps to consider. The vast majority of the workshop will be going through plants in different categories and just really diving into what I think are some of our top choices. Somewhere in there, we'll take a brief break as well. So, what is a water-wise plant? Well, most simply put, it's a plant that loves life here. So what's a water-wise plant in the Pacific Northwest might be different than what water-wise plants down here in inland Southern California are. They are very well adapted. What do they have in common? Well, they're probably going to do more for us than the plants they're replacing. True California native plants tend to provide valuable habitat for pollinators, birds, and butterflies. So all water-wise plants are not California native. And at the same time, not all plants native to California are necessarily water-wise plants in inland Southern California. So when you hear California native plant, what that really refers to are plants that evolved in California. So sometimes people think like lavender and rosemary, maybe lantana, are California native plants. Those plants are water-wise plants with lavender and rosemary coming from the true Mediterranean region, but they evolved in the Mediterranean. They're not California native plants. And some plants that are not from California still provide resources for wildlife. But if you're interested in not only having beauty, but also providing those resources to support our local pollinators, songbirds, and butterflies, on balance, the vast majority of the time are local California native plants that have evolved with those relationships with our native pollinators, birds, and butterflies are going to do the best job to support them. So that's a little bit of the difference. Water-wise plants are just any plant that's going to do well here and won't require a lot of supplemental irrigation here. And when we talk about California natives as well, a lot of the California native plants in the horticulture industry are water-wise, but there's also some plants you can get from wetlands. There's plants that come from coastal cloud forests, redwood forests. So those aren't all water-wise plants either. So there's a little bit of differentiation, but it's not that complicated. And then together, one thing that they have in common is that they will tend to make your yard a exciting place where something is always changing. I talk about this in some of my other workshops, but the traditional kind of lawn and roses landscape, you're kind of always trying to keep it the same throughout the year. A lot of mowing, a lot of fertilizing to keep that lawn green year round. Where with our water-wise and native plants, you're kind of embracing the seasons. And in Southern California, in our inland areas and on the coast and in the city, there's always something coming into bloom and always something going out of bloom. And with the wildlife in our gardens, there's always something showing up, and oftentimes there might be something leaving for the season. So they're very dynamic places. and they're lovely to be. So another key concept for those of us in the Inland Empire, San Gabriel, San Fernando valleys, this area isn't a desert. People who should know better, especially a lot of our politicians, often say like, well, this area is a desert. We need to live like that. That's actually not true. On years like this, our rainfall is similar to the amount of rainfall a desert gets in a year, but technically we're a semi-arid Mediterranean climate. Mediterranean climates have cool, wet winters and hot, dry summers. Deserts get summer thunder showers and have slightly different weather patterns. A lot of desert plants do grow well for us in our local landscapes, but a quote sustainable look or a locally native look for our landscapes, if that's what we want, isn't a desert garden. It's actually quite different, and there's quite a lot more foliage and a lot of other options. Many of our waterwise and full sun adapted native plants tend to have one of these features: gray or silver leaves, glossy or leathery leaves, fuzzy leaves, or some of them will kind of close up shop for the summer, go dormant, and just by watering like one time a month in the summer, we can keep those plants that would tend to go dormant in the wild looking quite a bit nicer. And with all of those features, a lot of those give us these great looks that are fun to use in design. So on the right, here's a picture of a narrow area along a house, right between this is west facing stucco, white reflecting heat house and a sidewalk not too far from the street. So pretty hot area. And here are some examples of that with a Allen Chickering sage with the gray, slightly fuzzy foliage. We have the leathery leaves of manzanita here. And then we have the succulent gray bluefinger over here. And even with toyon, with the kind of leathery leaf, this large shrub, and the new growth has a slight fuzz on it that catches the light in a really beautiful way. So these become great factors to use in design. Here's a picture from my front yard in the spring. This is fragrant pitcher sage, which also has a fuzzy leaf. And if you capture it, see it backlit in the morning or afternoon light, you can see this isn't Photoshop enhanced. They just seem to glow along the edges. So here are some of our local native plant communities. Not necessarily that we're going to be directly emulating them in our yards, though if you want to, you can. But again, we're not a desert. Oak woodland, even our chaparral, our dry exposed slopes, tend to be covered with a lot of vegetation, rock in between. Oak savanna, this is from Santa Rosa Plateau in San Diego County, because most of our grassland and savanna areas in our local areas turned into agriculture a long time ago. So this is a nice remnant that I like to look back at as what might have been in some of our valley bottom areas historically. Meadow grassland areas. And so even though in our recent series of really deep droughts, our wild areas do suffer, if you look back at the kind of scientific historical projections, we have had mega droughts within the last couple of thousand years. And even though individual plants suffer, these native plant community types do tend to be resilient and survive, even to where you can have things like this, middle of a drought, sheer rock face, hasn't rained in a long time, and beautiful green foliage in some of our local California native plants. There are hundreds of well-adapted, beautiful plants to choose from. Maybe thousands, but hundreds easily available in the horticulture industry. So it used to be very simple. If you had a front yard, you'd have turf, maybe some roses, maybe a tree, maybe a foundation planting. And now it seems like it's the Wild West. And so people, if they want to be ambitious and redo their front yard, sometimes what you end up seeing is people go to the nursery and get one of this and one of that and one of this and one of that. And they end up with a really big jumble in the front yard that's hard to maintain, even if there's some great plants there. So we're not going to get too much into the design because we focus on design in other classes. We're talking about the plants themselves today, but I always like to bring up the quick note. For most of us who are not trying to become necessarily like enthusiastic gardeners, that's your identity, that's your hobby. For most of the people who I work with in these workshops and in our programs who just want a nice garden, maybe to draw some butterflies or some birds and support pollinators, most of us were collectively in kind of search of the new default for our yard and garden. And here's what I propose. Not that we get rid of all lawns. I also love to grow fruit trees and vegetables and have a large vegetable garden and many fruit trees in my backyard. But for our areas where we don't have anything else we're specifically using them for, whether it's the lawn for the kids, the dog, the fruit trees, the vegetables, for our default areas, I propose that in general, easy to grow, low water California native plants can be this new default. And specifically some of the ones I'm going to talk about, which are some of the easiest to grow, easiest to find ones, because they'll provide as much beauty as any other plants possibly can, do a great job supporting our wildlife and bringing that wildlife that's so nice to see outside of your window or through the screen door, the butterflies, the songbirds, things like that. Why wouldn't we move in that direction? You don't need 172 species unless you want them all. If you want them all, if being a gardener and learning about plants and seeing all the different plants and what they do and trying to figure out where best to, fit this 173rd different plant in your yard is, that's great. Go for it. That's how my partner, who's also a professional horticulturist, and I garden at our house. But for most people, you can have 10, 12, 15 different plant choices, maybe for a full front yard or backyard, or even less if you want to, and have an amazing garden that's also going to be easy to maintain. So just a quick outline. Generally, if you're thinking about this for the first time, I encourage you to look at lots of other landscapes, do some research, get inspired, consider what you want. Again, consider what you want to maintain. Sometimes simpler is better. Set your goals for your landscape, research, come up with a good plan, build it, and then enjoy it. But it starts with research and thinking about what you want. We have a lot of other classes that really go into it. I'd encourage you, if you're thinking about this for the first time, to join us for the Landscape Transformation Basics class that we teach on a Thursday evening once a month, where you can sign up on our Eventbrite page where you signed up for this. And we are here to help you. I'll talk about other online resources. Plants are the most exciting part for many people, but they're only part of that formula for success. So for the best results, combine what you learned today with our other resources and classes. So you can check out our upcoming online workshops at cbwcd.org/waterwise workshops, or however you found us through Eventbrite, Waterwise Community Center. And then also here is the link to our recordings of all our past workshops over the last year that we've been teaching online workshops. That's at cbwcd.org/YouTube. That'll bring you right to our workshops playlist. So our primary factors for placing plants into groups in our landscape are to think about the sun and the shade requirements of the plants and take that seriously. I see so many people who put plants that want to be in full sun in too much shade when they already have some existing trees on their site, and sometimes they don't thrive. Do a little bit of research, and I'll share with you some favorite sources of doing that research online, and make sure you're putting your plants in the right amount of sun. Full sun is defined in our area as 6 or more hours of direct sunlight, so it doesn't need to be all day, morning to sunset, but the right amount of sun or shade, the right soil type or drainage. A lot of waterwise or California native plants want what's called well-draining soil. If you have that well-draining soil, it's all very easy. If you have poorly draining soil or heavy clay soil, which quite a number of people do, you're still going to be just fine as long as you choose the right plants. And so you'll want to do some extra research. Again, I'll share with you some sources for that, to just make sure that the plants you're choosing are adapted to clay soil. plenty of great plants to choose from. In fact, it might make choosing even a little bit easier because you can eliminate the ones that can't take those conditions. It's difficult / impossible to change your soil type, especially on a very kind of quick, I'm going to be planting in 2 months and I want things to be different. That's just not going to happen. Don't even think about that. Part of sustainable gardening is understanding your site, accepting that, and going from there. I'm not going to go into how to do that drainage test in this workshop. We cover it in a lot of other workshops, but we extensively cover it in a workshop called Choosing, Purchasing, and Planting Water-Wise and Native Plants, which is on our YouTube page. And we really go through that step-by-step drainage test so you know what to consider for the plants you can select. If you can just look at all those plants that need well-drained soil, or if you should select plants adapted to clay soil. And then irrigation frequency, essentially grouping the plants that need to be watered at the same frequency together. So in general, most of our California native plants in our local gardens, after they're established, as a starting point, most people water them deeply about once a month in the months that we don't get a good soaking rain event. Most of our general kind of Mediterranean plants, lavender, rosemary, things like that, those will be about twice a month in the warmer months. And then things like our fruit trees, depending on the selection and how established they are, generally a good deep soak about once a week. For some of the older ones, maybe 2 times a month with a deeper soak. And so we want to group our plants together that are going to be happy with that same frequency of watering. And again, I'll share a resource with all that information for you. After that, you can start thinking about other aspects of design, things like the leaf color, the texture and shape of the branches and the leaves, the structure, form, and density of shrubs, bark texture and color, and that visual design, which often relies on concepts like contrast, layering, and repetition. We're not going to, again, really get into that. We're talking more about the parts of that. So check out our design-focused workshops if you want to then combine what you learned today with those sorts of concepts. So on our YouTube page, we have a recording of our California Native Design Workshop, Do-It-Yourself Landscape Design Workshop, and you might check out both of those if you're going to be working with California natives, because we talk about different kinds of planning and kind of more general concepts in the Do-It-Yourself Landscape Design Workshop. And then also on the website that I'm going to show you soon, inlandvalleygardenplanner.org, which is our website that we have most of our plant information, we're working on a huge amount of design content to kind of guide people on creating their own landscape designs. And that'll probably be up and available to the public sometime in the summer. So again, sign up for our newsletter and you'll get those announcements. And then in our service area, we offer a residential landscape design assistance program where our staff will actually work with you one-on-one. Right now, we do it over Zoom meetings to come up with a full planting plan for either your front yard or your backyard. So that's available to water customers of Chino, Chino Hills, Cucamonga Valley Water District, Monte Vista Water District, Ontario, Fontana, or Upland. It's a no-cost program that has a refundable deposit. When you put in your project, you are able to get that deposit back. We have these design styles with plant palettes for you to take a look at to see what you like. We kind of use that as a starting point and then customize from there. You send us information, measurements, photos of your site, and then we'll create, working with you, a planting plan. So this is an example of a planting plan that we created, mostly California native and habitat plants for a front yard in Chino Hills, which has now gone in, and the residents are loving their new garden. So you can get all the full details about that at cbwcd.org/design assistance. And so now we're going to look at that main resource very briefly before I get into the next part, which is just plant by plant, category by category, all the plants that I most love for this area. I did see some questions coming in, so answer those before I get going because they're soil questions. From Margaret, with decomposed granite soil, I seem to need to water more. Any suggestions comparing your water once a month? So all sites are different. With decomposed granite soil, I will say that for a lot of the California native plants that are well adapted to that soil, like I have gardens that I've taken care of. We have a section of our garden at the Waterwise Community Center, which is literally just like almost gravel. We still generally water a lot of the year once a month, but very deeply, sometimes every 3 weeks in the middle of summer. But if you are really getting that deep watering, if you're really working with true California native plants that come from like dry chaparral areas, generally, even with DG soil, for established plants, you generally don't need to go more than once every 3 weeks. For like Mediterranean plants, every other week to maybe a little bit more often. But oftentimes when I work with people who are having those issues, when they do water, they're not getting that deep penetration through the whole root zone, like really not just a couple of inches down, but you want to dig down and, is it really wet at even a foot down? Lets you know that your moisture has penetrated to like at least 18 inches when you do water. So from Christy, another soil question. I have sandy loam in North Pasadena. Yeah, that's great soil for growing a lot of these plants. I used to live in a couple of different places in Altadena and used to work in San Marino, so I'm familiar with those soils. Generally great. We're surprised to find extremely high nitrogen. Seems to be stunting the growth of the natives. What can I do to correct a high nitrogen situation? So in general, so high nitrogen is kind of a weird problem to have. It's probably residual fertilizers because the local soils in most of our areas are low in nitrogen. You might try, I hate to recommend like wasting water, but you might try a few over a couple of weeks, like very, very deep irrigations. If you're just kind of strangely accumulating a lot of nitrogen, it might be, if you're new to your property, it might be some residual chemical fertilizers, which you can flush out. If you've been there for a long time, maybe someone used to have like a huge chicken coop in that area when that area was a ranch or something like that. But more often with high nitrogen, some of the native plants will tend to grow too quickly rather than being stunted. So I'm not sure. If you have other questions towards the end of the workshop or at the end of the workshop, I can try to answer things better, but it's a kind of curious situation. My first thought would be to ask you some questions to make sure that there's not something else like irrigation related that are stunting the native plants, because high nitrogen would be a strange reason for them to be stunted. Okay, so thanks for the questions. Keep them coming in. And let's explore plant information and inspiration website we created for you. So every plant we cover today is going to have a profile on this website. It is the Inland Valley Garden Planner. So specifically, our agency created this for gardeners in the Inland Valley. If you're not in the Inland Valley, same thing that I mentioned earlier, most of these plants, if you are in like more coastal California, will work for you. If you're in true desert areas, a lot of these plants will work for you, but some of them won't, either because of heat or if you're in the high desert because it freezes. So for the plants that will work for you, this is going to be good information, but you'll want to combine this with other resources, local knowledge, asking people at your local nursery if these plants are appropriate, if you're in one of those more extreme climates than are already somewhat extreme Inland Valley areas that this is focused on. So on the Inland Valley Garden Planner, there's a number of other things that I suggest you check out. We have those garden styles of the kind of pre-coordinated list. We're going to be adding all that additional design content, but the real heart of this website is the plant finder. So you can always search. So if you want to pull up the profile from a garden or a plant that we talked about today, you can just search. But it's also helpful for finding plants based on your criteria. So for example, if you know that you want a suggestion for a tree that's going to be in full sun and be low water, and maybe you do want it to be California native, and also maybe it's good for birds and wildlife. Then you've gone from the 350 top plants we've already chosen for this website down to 50. And then you can start looking at what things look like, and then also checking out the sizes for them, because some of these shrubs are going to be like California bush sunflower, which is a shrub that I love, maybe about 6 feet wide and about 4 feet tall. Whereas Toyon down here is going to be 15 to 20 feet wide and tall. So you can start to eliminate down from there. And then maybe you have clay soil as well. So for those of you, whether it's clay or not, if you have slowly draining soil, go to that plants for clay soil, because even if you have like a little bit of compaction on sandy soil, that's dealing with your making your infiltration rate after it rains, kind of the soil stay wet for longer, then it's going to be the same things you need for the plants for clay soil that can handle a little bit slower drainage. And so there, then you're down to 30, but still lots to choose from. And then within that, for any of these plants, you can then click on it and get the profile, which will have pictures from different situations, a description of the plant, covering the water needs, so you can learn how to group the plants. And you'll see that the way that these were selected, they go into 4 irrigation schedules, and they are intended to be flexible. So this is kind of general, and it's not a hard, fast set thing. Sometimes you can even flex it out a little bit more, but intentionally, like the lowest schedule, which is this low schedule 1, will meet the plants that can take a little bit more water. So you can kind of combine them together. So take a look at it as well. And there's some flexibility intentionally built in based on what we see in the reality of how you can combine plants in the real world. At a certain point, to provide guides, you make it abstract, but it's not like you can only group schedule 1 plants with schedule 1 plants. There's some flexibility across kind of those adjacent schedules as water needs increase. So hopefully that makes sense. And if not, there's other links that you can follow that really break this down quite a bit more, including, because we don't know the size of people's gardens, everyone's irrigation system, if you have an irrigation system, puts down water at a different rate. So watering for an hour can be a ton of water or actually not that much water, depending on how your irrigation system is set up. And so we have the recommendations set up in terms of inches of water, as if, for example, it'd be like one time you get a 1-inch rainstorm. So what does that mean in terms of you actually, like, how long should you set your irrigation system to do that? So we have a link that kind of walks you through for your irrigation system, depending on the kind of irrigation system, a couple of different tests you can do and calculators that I've put together where you could enter the results from those tests in, and it kind of tells you what your precipitation rate is in terms of inches per hour, or actually in that calculator, inches per minute, or fractions of an inch per minute. And then it gives you kind of that runtime in terms of the number of minutes you need. So kind of deeper information on there. Then the basic plant properties that you need to know to put that right plant in the right place, the height, the width. The flowering season is useful to have, especially if we're trying to have flowers year round, both for beauty as well as for supporting pollinators and butterflies. And once you plant them, you're going to need to know how to maintain them. So maintenance. A lot of times, the maintenance is very simple. But for example, you need to know if you cut them back to clean them up once a year, how hard do you cut them back? Do you do it in the spring or the fall? It's different depending on the growth cycles of even plants from very similar locations. If there's a long entry for the maintenance, sometimes it's just telling you all the things that I see that gardeners sometimes do that you don't need to do. Some of these plants are better left almost alone. So read through it, but don't be intimidated. And then there's some other kind of plant lists that they're associated with and some other links. One thing to note for the water schedules, these are all for established plants. Usually the first year and a half, plants are going to need more water. In general, most native and water-wise plants, a good deep soaking once a week in the first year, and then tapering off eventually to the established schedule. We have a whole online workshop, installation and establishment of California native and water-wise plants that goes through that in detail. And if you're going to make use of this, you can also you can sign up and create your own login, which will let you kind of create and save lists. So a list for your front yard, list for your backyard, list for your neighbor's house if you're helping them select plants, things like that. And so you don't need to kind of start from square one each time. So that's the Inland Valley Garden Planner. And we're, again, constantly working on new features, and we're working on a huge new update with a lot of design content. So sign up for our newsletter and you'll find out all about that. So with that, I will answer one question that came in, and then we will get it down to starting our top plants recommended section. From Hui Wen, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. In a webinar from another organization, learned that gravel or decomposed granite tends to have more evaporation because of the heat absorption nature. Do you recommend using these kinds of materials for ground cover or around plants? So one answer that you will get often in horticulture is it depends. It is true that there can be more heat absorption if you are doing like that wall-to-wall kind of gravel mulch, like I showed in early on in the presentation, and especially if there is no shade. However, some plants, especially plants from desert areas, are just fine with it. If you are going to use gravel mulch, then I encourage you to plant like some desert trees as well to provide some dappled shade. Sometimes wood chip mulch is great. Decomposed granite mulch has advantages and disadvantages. It really depends on the plant you're growing and your goals for the area. If you check out on our YouTube playlist, if you're really trying to figure out what's going to be best for your garden, we have a compost and mulch for waterwise gardens workshop, where in the mulch half of the presentation, which is at the beginning, I go extremely deep into the different kind of mulches, advantages and disadvantages of each one, which even though it's, you might be thinking, do I really need to listen to a 1-hour workshop about mulches or an hour of workshop content in a 3-hour workshop that's all about mulches? But if you think about it, your choice for how to mulch your garden, how to cover up the soil, what materials to use, you're going to see wall to wall across your garden for quite a while until your plants start to grow in, and then even in between the plants. So it's a pretty important decision. You probably think more than an hour about what material you're using to redo the flooring in your house. So it's worth looking into. Also in some of our other workshops, including our California native garden design workshop, we talk more about those mulch elements of the landscape. So yeah, it depends. Okay, so we're going to go from here into the plant by plant section. Just one quick note. This is just one suggestion for what I see to be a very viable new basic plant palette. So I'm not saying don't plant anything except this. There's tons of other awesome plants to plant. But I wanted to provide something for people who want a top recommended list of great plants for our area that are plants that more often than not, you might need to go to a specialist nursery, and I'll provide a list for our local area, but more often than not, you could find, like, there's some great California native plants that I can normally only like find them from a nursery every couple of years. And when I see them, I buy them. I'm intentionally not putting those plants on this list, even if they're great plants, because I don't want you to get excited about it and then not be able to find it. Not guaranteeing that you can always find all of these plants, but they're ones that there's the high likelihood, or if the nursery's sold out, that probably the next season when the fresh crop comes in from the wholesale nursery, there's a good chance that you can get your hands on it. So it's just one suggestion. And with that, we're going to start with the largest and longest lived plants, which are the trees. Hopefully they'll be the longest lived plants in your yard. If you select them well and plant them well, then that's a good chance that they will. Couple of reasons to start with trees. They're kind of the most important thing to site really well, and they're going to create shade over time. So they're going to have a large impact in the garden as they kind of change the whole microclimate. So here we go. We're going to start with the small trees. One of my favorites is desert willow. So you'll see on all of these, we have the common name, desert willow, and then the Latin name here, Chilopsis linearis. A lot of people are intimidated by Latin names. You don't need to memorize all the Latin names. You don't even need to memorize all the common names. But I encourage you, if you're going to choose these plants and actually go shopping for the plants, at least write down the Latin names. With this one, for example, desert willow, that's pretty explanatory. But a number of the other plants might have 5 different common names, or the names here, in English. Sometimes in Spanish, there's another 1 or 2 or 3 common names for the plant. But there's only one Latin name for each plant. So that'll make sure that you are getting the right plant. So for example, another plant that's in this list, desert mallow. It's also called apricot mallow. It's also called, there's at least one other name for it, but it only has one Latin name. So no matter what the common name is labeled at the nursery, if you look at the label or if you ask someone and you have the Latin name, you'll be making sure that you get the right plant. Or sometimes if you only have one common name for it, you might go to the nursery and think they don't have the plant that you're looking for, but maybe they do. There's just a different English name on the label. The Latin name will get you the right thing. So now on to desert willow. One of my top favorite small trees. Have it in my backyard next to my patio. We have a number of them in our demonstration gardens at the Waterwise Community Center. These are California native plants, but from the true desert, also growing out into even farther into the real desert. I've seen these growing alongside asphalt roads, wild, outside of Las Vegas, like going out to the Red Rocks area out there, if you're familiar with it. Super, super tough plant. They like to grow along the asphalt road because it washes off and gets them a little bit more water there, but super tough plants. They natively out in the desert grow in those kind of stream-side areas, not down in the stream, but where a little bit more water accumulates seasonally. But great, super tough plants for our yard, once a month water. Full blasting sun. We have one of these next to the parking lot at the Waterwise Community Center, where it gets full western afternoon sun and reflected heat from the asphalt. A few years ago, where we had that one day that it was like 115 degrees around here, even a lot of our local California native plants looked miserable. This thing was just in its element. It turned all that heat into more flowers. It flowers pretty much spring through summer, the whole warm season around here. And these flowers are loved by hummingbirds and pollinators. It is deciduous. It does lose all of its leaves in the winter, but sometimes that's nice next to a patio area where, for example, maybe you want the sun to come in during the winter, but you want some shade or protection from that afternoon heat. This is a relatively young one. They will get 20-ish feet tall and wide over time, but they take pruning and shaping really well. Occasionally you see a very old one that's a little bit larger than that. And they also do well, like you can see it here, where they're next to, but not directly in a dry stream bed. And seasonally, when that little bit extra water comes through, they don't mind that. So here's a close-up of the flowers. They're basically like a tree filled with little orchids, almost. Couple of notes. There are different what are called cultivars, so like named varieties. If you just get the species, you can get anything from a flower that's almost white to something like this. But to select for nice flower colors, you can also get ones that are like have names. So there's a common one called burgundy that has an almost burgundy flower. There's one called Bubba. There's a few other different names around, and you can look up what those flowers particularly look like for those. Those are all propagated from cuttings, so you know exactly what the flower color is going to look like. Another one of my favorite small trees, this is the other one that I have in my backyard, and we have one in our park at the Waterwise Community Center, and I want to plant more, is Desert Museum Palo Verde. This is starting to become a very common tree in landscaping in Southern California, with good reason. This is the one with the green bark when you see the bark in full sun and lots of yellow flowers. It's kind of an open, lacy form. This is another one that can really take full blasting sun or next to, but not in dry stream beds, all that reflected heat, just fine for parking lots. However, it does like to branch kind of low. And in fact, I like it more as a multi-branched tree with even a lower branching, but in a patio space, you need to kind of get a single trunk for a little while so people can walk around it. So you can find it trained from the nursery in different forms. It flowers these beautiful yellow flowers for much of the warm season, loved by pollinators, hummingbirds, bumblebees. things like that. The flowers do drop profusely throughout the season, so you can see them on the ground here. So if you're the kind of person who the flower drop will annoy you, you always need to sweep them up. Probably not the tree for you, but I think of it as being lovely. It's kind of like snowing flowers underneath, which is great. This one does attract, a lot of flowering plants attract bees. Almost any plant with a flower will attract bees. This one particularly does attract a lot of not just native bees, but the honeybees. So if you or your kids are extremely allergic to bees, might be one to not put next to your patio area, or if you're going to plant it farther away from where you spend a lot of time. Most people who are involved in horticulture aren't afraid of bees because we know you just ignore the bees and they'll ignore you. But if you do have a true allergy, might not be the best choice. Just saw a good question come in about desert willow specifically, but I'll answer this for all trees that we're going to talk about. Do they have invasive roots? Will they get into the sewer pipe? While there are a few trees known to have very invasive roots, here's normally the situation. If you have a sewer pipe that's in good condition and not leaking, the roots won't grow into it. There's no point. When roots grow into a sewer pipe, it's because roots will grow towards where they find water. If you have an old leaking sewer line, any plant and any tree will grow its roots into it. So none of these trees that we're going to talk about have a particular bad reputation for doing that. But if you have an old leaky sewer pipe that's close to needing to be replaced, any tree will grow into it. If that sewer pipe has been replaced and it's like a modern sealed plastic line, roots are not going to go into it. There's no point. There's no extra moisture coming from it. And so good question. How old are the trees that I am showing you? So this desert willow, I planted a desert willow in my backyard from a 1 gallon plant. And that was like coming up on 2 years, and it's a little bit smaller than this. It'll be this tall within this year. Oftentimes, I was lucky to find it as a 1 gallon plant. Oftentimes, you can only find it as a 5 gallon plant. So this could be anywhere from 3 to 5 years old, probably. The Palo Verdes sometimes don't grow a lot in their first year, but then they really get going. This one could be 4, 5, 6, 7 years old, maybe a little bit older. They grow pretty quickly to getting close to their full size, and then they slow down a little bit. So the trunk's not that thick, which makes me think it's not super old here, but it's getting there in size. Toyon is a local native plant. Technically, it's a big shrub, but if you prune up the lower branches, you can turn it into a tree. This is not the best example. I'm currently growing some in our demonstration gardens and one at my house that we are slowly turning into trees, but they're not this big yet. And I've seen them other places, but just have not been there with my camera to take them. So, you know, if this probably grew as a shrub and then they pruned it up later, which is why you can see all of these different branches. But if you select fewer branches as it's growing, because you know it's going to be a tree, then you can get a much cleaner look at the base than in this image. It does want to be a multi-trunk tree, though. It'd be very difficult to keep it as just a single trunk tree. Toyon takes everything from full blasting sun to pretty much full shade. It's great in a wet to dry transition zone. It doesn't need a lot of water, but it can take a little bit of water, a little bit extra water. Butterflies and pollinators love the flowers in the spring, and then birds will love the fall to winter red berries, which come at a time where there's not a lot of other small berries for birds who eat those kinds of trees. Birds that eat those kinds of berries. So here is the flower buds, and you can see it's a beautiful leathery leaf that is just gorgeous year round. This doesn't go through a period where it looks kind of dormant at all. This is evergreen. Here are the big clusters of flowers, that cluster will be easily 4 or 5 inches across, and then beautiful berries. And then one for those of you who might be a little bit more adventurous in terms of the look of your small trees, or who really want to focus on habitat gardening. Toyon if you're focused on habitat gardening, that's like a no-brainer. Plant a toy on, whether you keep it as a tree or as a shrub. This is blue elderberry, sometimes called Mexican elderberry. There's blue elderberries from Europe, and then our local blue elderberries. They're technically the same species, different varieties, so closely related, but ours have adaptations to where we are. Gorgeous in the spring. These are another one that if you train it up as a tree, with a lot of work, you could train them to be a single trunk tree, but they're easier as a multi-trunk tree. And they're a little bit funky in terms of the aesthetic. I love it. This is one that, for example, at my house, I have it like on the side of the house where it's a little bit wider and I have room for something. Not something I would put as like the main specimen tree in the front yard. I do have a toy on as a main specimen tree in the front yard because it looks great year round. These are great in a wet to dry transition zone. They don't need a lot of water, but they can take a lot of water if there's water nearby. So if it's near the edge of a lawn or something like that, it should be just fine. Full sun to pretty much full shade is fine. Depending on the conditions, they'll often go summer dormant during part of the year. So they might lose their leaves in the summer. And then they can also go dormant in the winter. So the leaves will look great, and then they'll look terrible, even if it gets enough water sometimes in the summer, just depending on conditions, and then they'll drop. The spring flowers are absolutely gorgeous. We'll see on the next page, but you can see these big cream colored clusters. And then the berries are really important bird food. So they're an incredible habitat plant. So you can see here, and the flowers keep flowering for a while, and then the berries keep coming. So you can often have flowers supporting the pollinators and berries for the birds at the same time. Just saw a question come in. Is this the medicinal variety of elderberry? So I will never weigh in as to anything is truly medicinal, but is this the species that has traditionally been used in medicine? Yes, this is the species. If it's like elderberry, syrup or other things like that and lozenges, this is that species. The berries do need to be fully ripe, but they are edible. They are extremely tart. They do take a very long time to pull each of them off of the little stems and not get a bunch of stems in what you're doing, or the flowers for tea. This is the plant. So those are my favorite small trees. There's some other cool ones, but those are definitely my go-tos. If you have room for a large tree, top one for most of us and most of our areas that I would recommend is the Coastlife Oak. This is our most common native oak tree. Depending on where you are, there might be some other native oak trees. This is a pretty common plant in parks and some areas. There's street tree plantings, although they really don't like to have lawn underneath them. So a number of them where they're street tree plantings and like the lawns are around them, sometimes over time suffer. They sometimes look great for years, but these trees can be like 400-500-year-old trees easily if they are in a good situation and they are not negatively impacted over time. Most of the ones, even the large ones that we see around here, they were installed like when those areas were going in. So a lot of them aren't any older than 80 years old, but they look ancient sometimes already. If you have room for one, consider planting one. The canopy really wants to be 35 to about 40 feet wide over time. Sometimes you can plant them closer to other trees because, like, even if you see them in habitat in an oak woodland, I was working on a project that we were planting an oak woodland, trying to figure out the spacing. And so I went to an area where there's an oak woodland that I knew pretty well up above Pasadena and kind of walked out the spacing in between all the trees. And in a healthy looking oak woodland, you'll find them as close as 15 feet apart from each other. But if you planted it 15 feet apart from, just your other plants, they totally have a canopy over them over time. So they need some space. So, not everybody would plant a tree in their front yard where maybe the oak tree takes up the entire front yard over time, but it'd be worth it if you're thinking about it. They can take full blasting sun and then grow in and provide shade. One of the reasons why they are so worth it, not only because they're a lovely evergreen tree, but they are one of the oaks themselves are one of the two genuses of plants, with willows being the other, that are considered ecological hubs in most of California, meaning that there are so many interactions with the wildlife that they kind of become this hub of layers and layers and layers. And so what'll happen is there'll be like up to 5,000 insect and animal species as you build upon those layers that will interact with an oak tree. And then the other hub species, willows, are pretty difficult to grow in our yards and need a lot of water. So oaks are kind of where it's at for maximum wildlife support. I have one Coastlife Oak tree. It was the only tree in decent enough shape to leave standing when I moved into the yard where my partner and I live now. And every single morning and throughout a lot of the day, there is so much bird activity in that oak tree. We plant a lot of other plants to support wildlife, but the oak tree is like the condo complex where birds fly into, and then they fly back out into the gardens and they fly into it. I mean, it's really often for us to easily see at least 6 different species of small birds in the tree. They just absolutely like it, like to nest in them. Some birds will eat the acorns. And for example, this Coastlife Oak is the larval host plant to tons of butterflies and moths. And so the caterpillars are specialized on what kind of plants they will eat. So you might hear of like monarch butterflies that only need milkweed. That's just for the monarch butterfly. Other species will have other plants that they are adapted to. And so the oak tree supports, it's thought, up to 122 different species of butterflies and moths. And even though you might not commonly see moths at night, you might not care about them. And they're not all like moths that are going to fly into your house and eat your clothes. They're wild moths. Why this is all very important is because most species of birds, the baby birds, need to eat caterpillars. They can't just eat seeds, even if the adults eat seeds. Only very few species that's the case. They need basically a ton of protein to grow, and caterpillars are very important source of protein. So having a tree that has lots of different species of butterflies and moths, I mean lots of different caterpillars for lots of baby birds. So it's great for the ecosystem. And also, there's just nothing like being in the shade of an oak on a warm day. Even the relatively young oak in my yard, on a hot day, being in the shade it provides is like a totally different microclimate than being out in the full sun at the same time. Question from Debbie before we move on. Is there an invasive pest that is attacking oak trees right now? Yes, there is. There are a few. The biggest one of concern is the gold-spotted oak borer, which has been quite bad, especially down in San Diego, and I think is in Lancaster right now. So at the end of the day, if you really get into researching trees, the vast majority of trees have at least one, if not multiple, pests that could kill it. And so I'm still recommending planting oak trees, just like there's a pest for desert museum Palo Verdes. I don't know if there's any pest for desert willows right now. And a lot of our other landscape trees, if it's not one pest, it's another pest. And so they do show up. But then if we have a diversity of trees in our urban canopy and in our different yards, overall things tend to do all right. The little bit of optimism. We're not going to stop planting trees. And so, for example, in most of our inland valley areas, most of the oak trees, even with the multiple pests, are still doing pretty well. Most of the Palo Verdes are still doing pretty well. Something to be aware about, something too, if you're going to plant that tree, you can look it up, make sure you know what the signs of the pest invasion look like. But yeah, that's really what makes sense to do. So here is an older one in a parkway. So absolutely, absolutely gorgeous. So there does come some responsibility, with that. If there's a broken branch or something, tree trimming does need to happen with something so large, especially in a public space. If it's in the parkway, oftentimes the city will be doing the work. But if you have room for it, it is absolutely worth it. Magical tree. Another large tree that I would recommend, there's not too many different large trees that I'm going to cover. Some people don't have any space, but one that I recommend is the Catalina Cherry. This is botanically a close relative to a local native cherry that we have, but this is one that grows on the Channel Islands and gets taller and grows faster. So this one is okay in kind of a more frequently irrigated to dry transition zone. It's tall, 25 to 35 feet tall, but relatively narrow, 10 to 15 feet wide often, and relatively fast growing. So if you need a pretty tall screen close to the edge of your yard, then a row of these We have the screen at one of our basin properties where we have rows of these 6, 7 feet apart, and they're a beautiful, very low water, very easy to maintain screen between our basin and some condos or very close together single family houses next to it. They have beautiful spring flowers that are loved by pollinators, and then fruit follows that are eaten by the birds. They are botanically, they're the same genus, Prunus, as a true, like the cherry that we eat for fruit. But these are a very wild version. So if they're fully ripe, we technically can't eat them, but they're mostly the seed with just a thin fruit around them, and they don't taste the same as the cherries that we normally eat. So, as a curiosity, you can snack on them, but you're not going to sit down to a big bowl of Catalina cherries and enjoy it. Some people who are really motivated kind of dry them and do some things with it, but it's a very different, botanically very similar, but in terms of how we eat it, very different fruit. And it's a larval host plant for many different species of beautiful butterflies. Here are a few of them listed. And so here is the fruit close up. And then this is the first non-California native tree, but it works great in certain landscapes. This is the Marina strawberry tree. It's a slow-growing large tree from the Mediterranean, has beautiful winter flowers that are bell-shaped. It's botanically kind of like a distant cousin of our native manzanita, so very similar looking flowers if you're familiar with manzanita flowers, and a lovely red bark. And then it develops fruit, which are edible to people. They're interesting looking, but they don't look like much. Birds might eat some of them. But the flowers come in winter. And so at winter, when there's not a lot of flowering, hummingbirds and butterflies really make use of them. You can buy it as a single or a multi-trunk tree. I think it really normally looks definitely best as a multi-trunk tree. And one thing to think about if it's near patio space is those fruit will drop. The fruit are maybe about the width of like a quarter, maybe a little bit more. So when the fruit does drop, there is some cleanup, but you can see the flowers and the fruit right here. And so someone typed in the common name is the strawberry tree, which is true. But if you're looking for this one, needs to be the Marina strawberry tree. The Marina strawberry tree is a hybrid between one of the species that's its parents, which is just called strawberry tree, and another tree. The other strawberry tree is a nice tree as well, but grows extremely slow and doesn't have the red bark. So there's some similarities, but if you're looking for this one, you want to make sure it's going to be the Marina strawberry tree. And so with that, we're going to turn our attention down from the largest of the trees to the large shrubs, which might be a background or might be a single large shrub as an accent in the landscape. I'm seeing that it is 10:17 now, so we are about halfway through the workshop, getting close, and the shrubs are a pretty large section. So why don't we do our quick 5-minute break right now? So good chance to grab a cup of coffee, use the restroom if you need to before we get back to it. So basically 10:18. So we have a lot to cover still. We'll start up again at 10:23. So we will start again with large shrubs in about 5 minutes. We'll also start with answering a round of questions. So if you have questions, type them in during the break. Just as a reminder, I see there's a few hands raised. If you have questions, please type them to the Q&A. Because of the number of people on the workshop, we find that there's a lot of downtime if we start having people talk and microphone issues and things like that. So I'm going to lower the hands, and please feel free to type into the Q&A or the chat. And so it is 10:23. Let's get going again, starting with a couple of questions. So I had a question: is there a mulch that's better for dogs? Pulling out the gravel because the dogs eat rocks. So the best bet probably, and I'd start it in a small area if you have the kind of dogs that eat rocks. Normally wood chip mulch is fine with dogs. I mean, it's not, even if they kind of chew on things, and I'm not a dog expert, like wouldn't be good for them to eat, but dogs chew on sticks and things all the time. I've not heard of wood chip mulch really being a problem for dogs. Decomposed granite, certainly your dogs couldn't chew on it, which is like the almost powdered rocks, not quite gravel. So decomposed granite, dogs are fine with, but decomposed granite can get stuck in between the paws of dogs. I know people who then they find that the decomposed granite gets tracked into the house, or also they'll lie on it, especially on a warm day, because it can be nice and hot, but then sometimes the dust will get kind of in their fur. So hopefully that's at least of some help. Sarah had a question about being the North San Fernando Valley, hot summers, but on the north side of the house, seasonal, a lot of shade, and then in the middle of the summer, very hot and full sun. We have a whole section where we're going to talk about plants just for that area. Super common problem inland, and anyone with a house or a garage has a north side of it. So if it's an area to plant, really common, confusing area to plant, and I definitely have some top recommendations. And then from Laura, can the Marina strawberry tree be maintained in a pot, or is there a dwarf version of this tree? Good question. So the Marina strawberry tree over time, over a long time, wants to be like 30, 35 feet tall and wide. So I don't think you'll be that successful in a pot. They also don't like root disturbance. So once they're planted, it's not something you want to pull out of the pot, cut the roots back and things like that, which you do need to do when you repot plants every once in a while. However, so we talked about the Marina strawberry tree versus just the strawberry tree, just one of its parents. The strawberry tree itself does have a dwarf version. There's a couple of dwarf versions. So more common one you can find, and it's not always, you'll have to talk to some different nurseries and find them, but it's sometimes available. There's a dwarf version, maybe a couple, but there's at least one called Oktoberfest. And that one, you won't get the red bark, but you get the flowers and the fruit, and the leaves look nice. So that would be one that you could try in a pot as well. Again, not guaranteed because they're not super adapted to pots, but with cactus mix and well-drained soil, at least for a number of years, very similar to some of our native manzanitas. So you might try Sunset or Howard McMinn manzanita in a pot, and then you would get the reddish bark, similar flowers and smaller fruit, but more loved by birds. Okay, so with that, we will get into it with the large shrubs and accents. So one of my favorite is Toyon. I'm not going to go through the whole plant again because we just talked about it as a tree, but this is it as a relatively young small shrub. It takes pruning. So even if this Toyon left to its own devices would want to be 15 to 20 feet wide over time, in this narrower space with a little bit of pruning, you can keep it going up and not getting that wide. It's going to want to be minimum with a lot of work, 6 feet wide, but you can keep it to 8 to 10 feet wide with pruning and then let it get larger. This is one, and this one could have been in the small trees depending on how you prune it, but really grows as a multi-trunk. So you could prune it up some as a multi-trunk tree. This is Western Redbud, another one of my favorites. I do have one that I'm training as a tree to complement the Toyon. Those are the two ones I chose for my front yard, one evergreen, the Toyon, and this deciduous. So it's somewhere between a shrub and a small multi-trunk tree, 15, 20 feet tall ish over time. Occasionally in the wild and in a really good situation for it, you'll see them even taller. I've seen a couple of huge ones in the San Gabriel Mountains, but normally that's what we see. Does this in the spring, beautiful. Sometimes you'll also see it kind of be more of a combination, especially like mine gets some reflected heat from the street and the sidewalk. So it Won't ever be like this. It kind of starts to have some leaves and blooms at the same time, but still absolutely lovely. Then it gets these lovely thin heart-shaped leaves. Pollinators love the spring blooms, especially like big bumblebees, carpenter bees. And then leafcutter bees, which are a native non-stinging solitary bee, will actually chew some of the thin leaves. You'll see these little crescents kind of taken out of them, or these half circles, and they'll use those to construct their nests. But it's kind of ornamental what they do to the leaves, so that's cool. And then the seed pods that follow are basically bird food. You can see kind of where it's growing here. This looks like it's not necessarily a completely natural waterway, but in the wild, sometimes you'll see them in this area where they're not down in the water, but kind of perched above. So they're also okay in the kind of wet to dry transition zone, or they can be pretty dry. So here's another in the spring. You can see kind of the leaves coming out, and the leaves have almost this burgundy color as they're getting going. Just a quick note and kind of shout out. You'll see a number of these images are credited to the Theodore Payne Foundation Native Plant Garden Tour. And so the Theodore Payne Foundation Native Plant Garden Tour is an awesome tour that happens every spring. And mostly they'll have one day, it's a 2-day event. They'll have one day of the weekend that's in mostly the San Fernando and San Gabriel Valley. So very similar climates to where a lot of us are. And then one day that's more LA kind of city to coast area, sometimes getting out almost towards Orange County. Highly encourage you to check it out. This year, the whole thing is going to be online. So wherever you are, it will be easy to see, but you get to see a lot of insight into a lot of great gardens. nativeplantgardentour.org is where you can check that out. And then also for those of you thinking about plants and gardens, kind of maybe even the most exciting part is that they have archives of the photography of all of the past years of the gardens. So you can really check out a lot of great inspiration, everything from very fancy gardens to very kind of do-it-yourself kind of gardens. So encourage you to check that out. So either the pictures that I've taken there or some of the pictures that I borrowed from their website are all credited here. So here you can see the new growth, gorgeous, and then even the older leaves are very attractive. And then that's what comes next. And then as those kind of swell and fill, those pods are eaten by birds. Quick question came in from Sarah, who has 3 Western redbud trees that came as standards, so single trunk trees, which you can get them from the nursery trained like that, especially in larger sizes, but they don't love to live that way. So that's not doing well. Can she encourage the suckers at the bottom to become multi-trunk? Absolutely, Sarah. I would highly recommend it. So Western redbud trees, based on where they natively grow, are adapted to fire. And one of the kind of indigenous management techniques for them have long, like for hundreds, if not thousands of years, been to coppice them, basically to just cut them all the way to the ground to reinvigorate them and let them grow back. Now, if you have it as a standard, you probably bought it as a decent sized tree, you probably invested the money in it. I wouldn't just cut it down right now all the way if it's not doing well, but encourage some of those lower suckers to grow and then cut out that main one, and you'll probably be pleasantly surprised. Another thing, if you are maintaining one of these very long term, like once you're getting to year 15, 20 maybe, sometimes the individual of the older branches aren't quite as vigorous after a number of years. They don't flower as much. And so by maintaining it as a multi-trunk tree, you can, over many, many years, let some new ones grow from the base, which it will try to do every once in a while, or when it's young quite often, and then remove some of the older ones, which you just can't do with a single trunk tree. They really want to be multi-trunks. So yeah, just allow it to be, and I think you'll be pleasantly surprised, Sarah. And there's one in our demonstration garden that also came as a single trunk and didn't do well, and we cut it to the ground to kind of remove it, sprouted right back out as a multi-trunk. So I think you'll be fine. Next one, quite a bit smaller shrub, but can be 4 or 5 feet wide to hip to chest height, is Apache Plume. This is a true desert shrub, California desert out to kind of seen it in Nevada. I think it might grow in Arizona as well. It's doesn't have like the most distinctive form. It's kind of shrubby. The leaves are quite small, but the flowers are beautiful. The small flowers are just a small white flower, but then they're these feathery flower parts. I won't get into botanically what they are, but make these little plume-like things. That's why it's called Apache Plume. And is just, especially when it hits the light, just absolutely beautiful tree that can take the most punishing reflected heat sunlight. And so here it is up close. And because these are actually kind of dried out parts of the flower, these stay like this for months and months and months, even after the flowers fade. Very ornamental in a very bright full sun area with punishing heat. Kind of another one back on the flip side a little bit, which inland I wouldn't put in the sunniest areas, but can be full sun, especially with afternoon shade. It will appreciate it. Down to part shade are the manzanitas. Now I just chose one manzanita, but there are many manzanitas from different parts of California. Some of them are quite easy to grow. Some of them are a little bit more difficult to grow because they can be very sensitive to too much summer water. Some of them really are better to grow as wild native plants and to be appreciated like out on a hike. It can be very difficult to grow in the garden. But a number of them are quite simple. And this is the most common because it's adapted to the most number of different kind of garden situations you might have. It can take a little bit of extra water. Also the most commonly available. This is Howard McMinn Manzanita. Oftentimes some of the easiest to grow ones are hybrids between a couple of varieties. They're not as sensitive to a little bit of extra water. It gets white flowers for hummingbirds. The flowers look very much like the strawberry tree flowers, and butterflies also tends to come in the winter season. Red berries are used by the birds. Really great bird food. Beautiful red bark over time, and unpruned, they'll grow all the way to the ground. But once they get larger, normally they're pruned up a little bit to expose some of that. This is a quite old one. Normally you see them smaller in the garden, but so they do grow pretty slowly. But you'll see them as 6 feet, 8 feet, sometimes up to like 9 feet tall and wide. But again, you can do some pruning if you don't want it to get that big. All of the manzanitas appreciate a little bit of afternoon shade in the hot areas, keeps them healthier and longer lived, I feel. So here's the foliage close up. Completely evergreen foliage. They have those thicker, more leathery leaves, so they don't kind of go through any period where they, in the middle of the summer, like really look any different. Another one of my favorite ones that I didn't put on this list because I just wanted to choose one, but another one of my favorites is Sunset Manzanita. Also very easy to grow, very beautiful, but not quite as common to find. Next one on the list, back to another true desert one. Easy to keep smaller with some pruning, but often inland especially gets a little bit bigger than in like kind of more moderate temperatures. 5 to 6 feet wide, 5 to 6 feet tall. This is a really nice full one. Sometimes they're a little bit thinner and can be a little bit frost sensitive, I find, especially when younger. So this is actually one, the vast majority of waterwise plants I encourage people to plant in the fall. Inland, if you're in an area where it gets any frost, like even in my backyard, I tend to do better with spring planting. One of the few native plants that I'll wait and plant in the spring to get it through that first year. Fond of full blasting sun. This is another one. Takes in all of that extra heat in the summer, turns it into more flowers. In inland gardens, it flowers almost year round with these cool, like bottle brush, almost like blooms. Absolutely adored by hummingbirds. One of the top hummingbird plants around. And this one, I kind of consider it just to be a garden staple, important for a habitat garden, or if you need, sometimes you don't need all bright flowers all the time and just want some green in the background to help set off other plants, or something fast that can grow in to be a visual barrier. This is Coyote Brush. It's a fast growing green shrub. It has small flowers. When those flowers turn kind of start to dry out, they get this also fuzz with the flower parts. It almost looks like they're kind of flocked with snow at certain times of the year. It can be beautiful. It's not a great analogy, but there is that presence from the fuzz. Birds will eat the seed. It flowers normally in the fall, which is an important time for pollinators because a lot of the other stuff is kind of done flowering for the season. So to extend that season, we want to try to add carefully some fall flowering plants. The flowers aren't super ornamental, but really, really important habitat. And then the kind of dried out flower part, kind of fuzzy is a good word, kind of froth does then become pretty ornamental, especially if it's hit by the sun at the right angle. It happens to be a quite dense kind of shrub, so it's actually good for bird nesting and cover. And I like to use this as one of my top choices for what I call habitat hedges. So sometimes to increase habitat, especially for birds in a garden, I'll take some of my top favorite habitat plants and just plant them kind of close together, 5-6 feet apart in a hedge that's just kind of loosely hedged to make sure it doesn't get too wide for the space over time, just along the fence, property wall, something like that. This is a good one to mix into that. One of my absolute favorites for that habitat hedge concept is hollyleaf cherry. So this is our local native, kind of little relative of that tall Catalina island cherry. You can see it in bloom here. It's an elegant looking shrub year round with these kind of little bit waxy green leaves. Pollinators absolutely love these big clusters of flowers in the spring. Birds really love the fruit that comes afterwards. So you'll see birds specifically coming around to the garden and picking the cherries off. And it's a larval host plant for many beautiful butterflies. And then the third one that I'll often mix into a habitat hedge is California coffeeberry. This is another local native plant with a wide distribution, but does grow locally, can take full sun to pretty much full shade. So this is for shrubs, that north side of the garage situation, north side of the house. This is a great one. The cherry does pretty well too, but I mean, this is one that I've used from everything from under oak trees, that dense shade, to full blasting sun. Elegant looking year round, beautiful green leaves that are a little bit lighter on the new growth, a little bit darker on the older growth. Tiny spring to early summer flowers used by pollinators. Birds absolutely love the fruit that follows. And it's a larval host plant to many other different species of butterflies. There's also some great dwarf selections. So there's a great dwarf selection called Eve Case, which will get just as wide as the coffeeberry. So over time, 6, 8, maybe even 10 feet wide, but easy to prune to not have as wide. And then same thing for the height, but again, easy to prune. The Eve Case will get 6 to 8, maybe 8 feet wide over time, but normally no more than 4.5 feet tall. So yeah, coffeeberry, absolutely one of my top utility plants. So I have a habitat hedge in my front yard that also is just to provide a little bit of privacy, because out of the angle from the desk where I'm sitting right now, if I'm looking out the window right in front of me, then I mostly get an angle of a gravel strip and then the cars parked in my neighbor's driveway. So I have a habitat hedge on the north side of my house with a couple of those cherries from the last page, and then 4 of these coffee berries. It's absolutely lovely. And I also, at certain times of the year, get to watch when I'm sitting at my desk the berries of this. So for example, a couple weeks ago, I enjoyed watching a mockingbird pick off a berry from the coffee berry, which is a big berry for it to fit in its mouth, but it really likes them, lay it down on my neighbor's driveway, and then the driveway is sloped, so it started to roll, and watching it chase it all the way down the driveway before I was able to pick it back up again. So you just, by integrating these plants into your landscape, get to see all these kind of great interactions going on. So here is the new growth. You can see the light green and the older growth, and then the small flowers. So not the biggest, showiest things, but lovely in their own right. Flower buds. Another great one for the north side of the house. Inland does want partial shade, so either dappled shade from a canopy of a taller tree. In our demonstration garden, we have one of these under a large established sycamore, does very well. The sycamore is pruned up pretty high, so it gets some direct sun at different times of the day, but because it's underneath the canopy, not full blasting sun really. We have some underneath dense canopy of oak trees, do very well in terms of looking healthy, but grow quite a bit slower, and does very well like on the north side of a house. Wants to be kind of wide, so I think this is a little bit too tight of a situation. The leaves themselves have kind of small thorns, not as bad as like cactus, but kind of like oak tree. And so I wouldn't necessarily want to be walking along this path all the time, but maybe the plant is so beautiful, if it's not a primary path, it's just worth it. Beautiful, glossy-ish, leathery-ish green leaves year round. Does this in the spring, loved by pollinators, and then gets big clusters of berries that the birds eat. So lots of color going on at different times of the year between the blooms and then the berries later on. So here you can see the leaves, you can see kind of a little bit scratchy, and then the berries. So absolutely great on the north side of a house where you want a larger kind of shrub with a bit more presence. And so those are the top large shrubs. Again, there's other great ones, but just to kind of break it down with lots of great choices for a simple landscape, those are my top go-tos. And now let's kind of move it down a little bit to that middle layer. So oftentimes those large shrubs are used either as an accent or a background from whatever the main perspective is that you're looking at it from a landscape. Oftentimes that's inside a window looking out, or maybe out in the yard, driving by, however you want to set up the landscape. And then usually in front of that, there's a middle layer, or sometimes the medium and small sized shrubs are also up against the building. Lots of different opportunities for how to use the medium and small sized shrubs. And they're very important in the aesthetics, the visual design, in terms of building layers and visual depth. So even in a small garden, having some taller trees, even if they're small trees in the background, and then a medium layer in the middle ground, and then lower perennial plants, ground covers in the foreground, builds a sense of depth and layering into the landscape. And so here's just a couple examples of working with kind of different layers. This is a house in Van Nuys, California. I was able to visit on the Theodore Payne Foundation Native Plant Garden Tour. And so you can see when they redid their front yard landscape, this is a pre-existing, just traditional hedge property boundary between them and the neighbor. And then in front of that, in this relatively narrow bed, they're using some of those medium-sized shrubs. If there was just low, like perennials or ground covers here, be kind of boring because it'd be this hedge all the way down. So this is a good use of that medium layer. To achieve this, there's definitely some pruning going on here to keep these shrubs contained, but very beautiful. And you can see here, this is a good selection of all the different beautiful leaf colors, where even when plants aren't in bloom, just that foliage contrast. There's so many different design options for our beautiful native, water-wise, and adapted plants. Here is a picture from my front yard where you can start to see the layering. This is the young toyon, which is kind of medium size right now, starting to grow in. Here's kind of medium ground, and then some foreground of some of the smaller perennials. This is another example. In the background, you can kind of not quite see it yet. It's still growing in, is that habitat hedge I was just talking about with the coffeeberry back here, then some of our medium ground shrubs, and then foreground. And this isn't a huge front yard, it's not tiny, but by working with those layers, kind of very intentionally building that sense of depth and framing. And then talking about kind of planning for flowering year round. So this is pretty much the same view. This is in April. And then after these flowers fade, then same view, other things kind of grow in more for the season. And then there's a whole set of other flowers by kind of more true getting into summer. And so talking about those medium-sized kind of shrubs, one of the go-tos for me, if there's room for it, because as you can see, even starting to grow over the edge here, gets quite wide, are what are botanically called kind of Cleveland sage hybrids. There's 3 sages that you can find in the nursery: Allen Chickering sage, Pozo blue sage, or Whirly blue sage. Essentially, for you as a home gardener, they're pretty much the same plant. They're all a very easy to grow hybrid of 2 California native sages, which are the cross of the same parent plant. So very, very, very similar. use them interchangeably. They're okay in full blasting sun. They do need full sun. They're not going to do well in part shade. They smell amazing. One of my very favorite smells absolutely in the world is the smell of the leaves of this plant. Pollinators and hummingbirds use the spring flowers. And then if you let those flower stalks, instead of trimming them back right when the flowers are done, if you let them dry some and develop into like the actual seeds, they turn brown, but they're still pretty ornamental because you still see these like consecutive balls. And small songbirds like goldfinches and house finches, really beautiful small birds, will come around and peck the seeds out. And then eventually, after a while, you can cut them back. If you have a house that's not in like a fire-prone area, urban wildland interface area where you need to really worry about probably not using wood chip mulch, keeping things spaced apart in case there's wildfire. If you're just kind of like in an urban area, like my backyard in Pomona, after I cut these dried seed heads back on the vast majority of my native plants, I add those to the mulch layer. So in between plants, instead of needing over time to bring in more and more wood chip mulch, I start using that. And there's a whole other host of birds that will then come in and pick those same seeds off the ground. Can this grow in a pot? This is going to be too big for a pot. You often read on nursery labels for these plants that they're going to be 4-ish feet wide, maybe 4 to 5. Usually 6 to 7 feet wide in inland gardens where it's happy, occasionally even wider than that. You can keep it to 6 to 7 with pruning. Definitely going to be too big for a pot. There are some other plants that are great for pots. So I would encourage you to, if you're interested in any of these plants on the Inland Valley Garden Planner, there's also a check on that interface where you can do plants for pots is a good thing to check out. And then some of the other websites with really good information on native plants, including Theodore Payne Foundation and I think Tree of Life Nursery as well, have suggestions for native plants in pots, but most of the native sages are a little bit too big. Occasionally, they're not the more common ones, but occasionally there's a small one that you might be able to find at one of those specialty nurseries like the California Botanic Garden or Theodore Payne Foundation that might work in a pot. And you can ask them if they have anything in stock that would work. So here is the flower close up. Absolutely beautiful. They are mostly spring flowering, but because we've had a warm kind of late winter, they've already started blooming in my yard. A local native sage is white sage. This is absolutely another one of my favorite smells. Full blasting sun is just fine. And you can see the flowers are very different compared to a lot of the other sages. They're these long, kind of more sprawling white flowers. Really gorgeous, but hard to photograph if they catch the morning or afternoon light just right. Adored by pollinators and hummingbirds, especially like bumblebees and carpenter bees. I see them a lot on the white sages in my yard. And small songbirds absolutely love the seeds after that, especially the goldfinches. If you leave them on for a while, they will keep coming back for months after the seeds have developed and carefully picking out all the little seeds. One of our panelists, Karen, thanks for joining us, Karen, also typed in that the flowers of the white sage are delicious. I will have to try that. Very beautiful. Beautiful foliage close up. So it's another one definitely working with the color contrast. And so look at this. This kind of captures that backlit sense. So even if the shrub itself is somewhere where it's not, I mean, it's lovely there, but it's not really a showstopper. But then seasonally, wow. This plant in the foreground here is California buckwheat, very common local native plant. In some areas, the hillsides are just covered with it, but it is kind of a nice foliage contrast with the darker green to the really light of the white sage. And that's next on the list is California buckwheat. There's many native buckwheats to California. There's one that's called California buckwheat, and it's in some ways not the showiest of the buckwheats in terms of the flower, but it flowers a lot year round. It's so easy to grow, full sun to part shade, and just an absolute powerhouse of a habitat plant. So I talk about some of the other buckwheats. It's also the easiest to find in the nursery. Some of the other ones are great, but sometimes it'll be like, I'll be waiting on finding it for like a year before I can get it and put it in. Full blasting sun is just fine. I have one of these on the west side of my house next to a big section of asphalt driveway, gets full blasting afternoon sun and hardly gets any water, and it just loves life. Long bloom season, really important for pollinators and butterflies. Birds will eat the seed. Many butterflies use it as that larval host plant for the caterpillars, and then there's caterpillars for the birds. Super simple to grow. Does get pretty wide. This is another one. Some of the online resources say that this stays a little bit smaller than it gets inland. 5 to 6 feet wide inland is oftentimes what I see. Easy to prune back a little bit if you need to. Jennifer has shared a link that I'm going to put in the chat. Thank you, Jennifer, for native plants in containers from Las Politas Nursery. Las Politas Nursery is a San Diego County native plant nursery. Incredible website with tons and tons of great information. They are a reference that I use very often. So lots of other cool information on their website. Thank you for sharing that, Jennifer. So you can see here, so on the buckwheats, no matter what color the blooms start as, they fade to this kind of drying, rusty color. And that is part of the appeal and the look of buckwheat. So some people think, oh, these buckwheats are really hard to take care of because they're trying to deadhead, like they grew up thinking about like maintaining roses. And so as the blooms fade and start to turn that rust color, they're trying to cut off each and every one. That'll drive you crazy. There's so many blooms. In fact, the way to look at it is that this in its own right is absolutely beautiful. And as this goes on through the seasons, it'll be a mix to where like half of these will be white and half of them will be that rust color. Really, really beautiful. And even after they all turn that rust color, this is a plant that normally I don't do for the California buckwheat any pruning on. It doesn't need a cut back to clean them all off. I mean, you can once a year if you want to, but it doesn't need it. It doesn't need it to kind of stimulate more flowering the next year. You can just leave it on. The birds will like the seed. In fact, after they're dried, you can cut them for dried flower arrangements, bring them into the house. They're beautiful and they last a long time. This is a kind of extra showy kind of cousin, you could say a relative of our local California buckwheat. Grows to be about the same size, often about 5 feet wide. Both of them are maybe hip high. The California buckwheat, just depending on the nursery it came from, the genetics of that plant, sometimes need a hip high. Santa Cruz Island buckwheat, maybe about thigh high to maybe hip high over time, about 5 feet wide. And so Santa Cruz Island, so this is one that's native to the Channel Islands, but does really well inland, even in full blasting sun. We have some outside of our Waterwise Community Center where it gets the full western sun, reflected heat from the parking lot. They do surprisingly well. And these also will bloom almost year round in gardens with a lot of sun. Near here, big clusters, even a little bit showier than our native buckwheat plants. And even though they're not the local native, they're absolutely loved by pollinators and butterflies, especially some of the like little tiny pollinators, native bees that are hard to see until you really kind of slow down and look into them. We have both the California buckwheat. Actually, we just removed one because it grew too big in the space in the front of our facility. And this one on a hot day where a lot of native pollinators should have been out last summer. I went out to just kind of check out what pollinators were around, and I didn't see any on our California buckwheat. And I thought that was strange. And then I looked on the other side of the walkway and they were all on this thing for whatever reason. There's just something going on with this plant that they liked a little bit more. So really great pollinator plant, extremely beautiful. It has a kind of mid-gray green foliage. It also works as a really kind of nice contrast from some of the other subtle colors. Very easy plant to grow. Not the easiest plant to find because they sell out very quickly when they're in the nursery, but if you find it, I'd recommend planting it. And then this one, not really a true shrub, but it's a big, really big perennial plant, but it gets to the size where I decided to put it in with the shrubs because
it really needs to go in that mid-ground of the landscape. It's too large to be kind of at the edge or really in the foreground of most landscapes, like most of the plants that I'm going to cover in the smaller perennial plant section. So this is showy penstemon. This is a local native to where we are actually see them occasionally growing in vacant lots. There's one specific vacant lot on Monte Vista Street in Claremont that you'll see them just starting to flower, and then normally like that lot will have to get mowed down for like fire abatement, but they survive locally with just nothing, and then with a little bit of water in the garden, absolutely gorgeous. There will be long flowering stalks up to 5 feet tall in a garden that gets once a month water sometimes. I like to use them, and then after they're done, they're not that structurally stable. So after the seed develops some, I do cut them back. And to keep them vigorous, you want to give them a good cut back once a year. And the foliage itself at the base isn't that much to look at. So I like to use them, for example, like in between bunch grasses or in between other plants, where when they're cut back, they're just kind of green and you don't notice them that much. And then seasonally in the spring, you get this incredible display of flowers. So gorgeous flowering tall perennial. Hummingbirds and pollinators love the flowers. Birds eat the seed. Also, many beautiful butterflies are the larval host plants. So the caterpillars will eat the leaves. Just something to note for those of you who haven't done butterfly gardening before. On all of these where I'm saying that they're the larval host plant for the butterflies, the caterpillars eat the leaves. In the vast majority of cases, you will never even see that happening. There's not such a population that it's like being denuded or they're eating back and the plants look terrible. They're just kind of doing their thing. But then you'll see the butterflies in the garden and you think, okay, it's probably working. So here's an example of a picture from my front yard where you can see we have native deer grass and then the penstemons growing in between. And then when they get cut back, they almost kind of disappear. It's just a little green mound in between the grasses. Another one of my favorite colorful plants for full sun areas is this orange. Is just such a unique color. There's a few other plants that get orange flowers, but this is just such an orange. This is desert mallow. Full absolute blasting sun, just fine. Turns excessive heat, sun, reflecting off the sidewalk, gravel, streets into these beautiful flowers. Blooms a lot of the warm season. Really loves life inland. And this is one that's been pruned to maintain this kind of clean mounding shape. They get kind of wide, sprawly. They don't have the best structural form in terms of like garden aesthetics. They're kind of nice in their own way. But to keep them looking nice, they generally inland need to get cut back a couple of times a year, and they bloom so much that it's kind of hard to figure out when. So basically what I do is as soon as the bloom is, there might still be a couple blooms, but as soon as that main bloom is done, I'll give it a cut back. It'll grow right back out and bloom again usually. So I might cut them back a couple of times a year, once before it really starts growing in the spring, and then once kind of mid-season, and it'll bloom again. A lot of different butterflies use this as the larval host plant as well. It's a mallow. All of the mallows generally tend to be important butterfly plants, and flowers are also used by pollinators and butterflies. Beautiful kind of silvery foliage as well. So look at that. Who wouldn't want that plant in the garden? If you have a large enough kind of parkway, as we get into the smaller plants, we'll start talking about plants that are good for parkway, parking strip areas that can take that reflected heat inland. This is one where you'd want a 5 to 6 foot wide parkway to really accommodate it. Not that the plant will be that wide, but just to kind of have the space for it to look nice there. But this is a great plant for parkways. A lot of color. And then a relative of that is another mallow, another true desert California native. That is Palmer's mallow, and that has an even fuzzier silvery leaf with a different kind of orange flower. Full blasting sun is just fine. This tends to be a little bit bigger, 5 feet wide, and maybe definitely higher than hip tall, maybe kind of like lower chest for most people. The fuzz lets it capture the light really, really beautifully. If you see it like in the morning or the evening, tends to have a kind of a stronger kind of true shrub form, and absolutely beautiful larval host plant for not quite as many different butterflies, but some of them for sure. Here you can see the flowers on that. So good question that just came in. When you say cut a plant back, how far do you cut it back? Answer, it depends. So that's where all of that maintenance information on that Inland Valley Garden Planner website really gives you that information, because some plants, it's a pretty hard cut back, pretty deep into the branches. Some plants, it's a very light cut back, and the plants will definitely react better or worse depending on just the strategy that's best for what that plant is going to respond to. So for each plant that you plant, I really encourage people, make your own little maintenance guide where for each of the plants that you plant, have a picture of the plant so you always know the ID, and then have for that plant what to do in what season, whether it's copying and pasting the text from the Inland Valley Garden Planner or just reminding yourself to look at it. Yeah, creating your own maintenance plan is critical to keep things looking good. So, okay, to make sure you all know what I mean when I say parkways. So parkways, parking strips, those are in most neighborhoods in between the sidewalk and the street. There's a little strip of, tends to be lawn, but there's a little strip of something, and it's usually 4 feet wide, maybe 5 feet wide, occasionally 6 feet wide, sometimes wider, a little strip of landscape on the other side of the sidewalk if there's a sidewalk. So that tends to be a pretty difficult area to figure out what to do with, because inland it has a lot of sun, a lot of heat, and not a lot of width. So that's what I'm talking about when I talk about parkways or parking strips. And not all neighborhoods have them. My neighborhood has a sidewalk, but the sidewalk is right up against the curb. Some neighborhoods don't have sidewalks at all, and it's just landscape to the curb. So not going to be relevant for everybody, but if you have one of those, you might be thinking, what is it that I'm going to do with that space? This is another great one for north sides of buildings, north sides of garages, that funny part shade a lot of the year, but then full blasting sun part of the year. In general, if you're signing it, optimal to site it in like part shade, but it just does very well on those northern exposures, even with that high full sun in the summer, is what I find. I have a row of these on the north side of my house where it also gets western. It's open to the west, and they do very well. This is creeping Oregon grape. It's a much smaller relative of that golden abundance Oregon grape, the tall shrubby one with the beautiful yellow spring flowers that we looked at. And it has similar beautiful foliage. This foliage is a little thinner. In the winter with the cold weather, it tinges purple, and then eventually that purple will go away, but absolutely gorgeous just for the foliage. Big clusters of yellow spring flowers, followed by very similar berries to the golden abundance Oregon grape, eaten by birds. Very similar plant. It's called creeping Oregon grape because it slowly spreads, but it's super easy to control. So if it's ever starting to get a little too wide, you can either just pull out or trim back with the pruners some of those spreading branches. So it's not like invasive or weedy. And it happens very slowly. So it's like doing it a little bit once a year. Be fine. Another one of my favorites. Guess that's why they're all in here. All of these are my favorites, but I get enthusiastic about each and every one. This is brittle bush. This is a local native sunflower, grows from Inland Empire all the way out into true desert, and flowers like this much of the year. Slows down in the winter, sometimes stops flowering, but most of the rest of the year, if it's warm, it's flowering. It's another one that refreshing, kind of harder cut back on this one is great for it once a year, but it's hard to decide when because it flowers so much. Flowers are adored by butterflies and pollinators. If you let some of those flowers dry out to develop seed, little birds like to eat the seed. And in large ones, little birds like to hang out in it, kind of use it as shelter as well. So there's one that's a little bit larger than I would like to get off of patio space in my backyard, but my partner and I decided not to cut it back this year because birds are always using it as shelter. And then we get to see the birds coming in and out of the shelter. We have a bird bath nearby. So it's just working so well that we're going to give it some extra time, and we'll have to cut it back eventually, but we skipped it this year. So those are the sorts of conundrums you get into once you have so much life going on in your garden. Really beautiful. This is one that it has like from wild reseeded on parts of the sides of some of our local freeway embankments where I see like the irrigation is totally capped off, not active at all. And sometimes in the late spring, especially into like summer, like all the irrigated landscape on the freeway looks terrible. And there's wild areas where the California buckwheat and this have reseeded, and they're gorgeous. And it makes me think, why don't they just do kind of more restoration seeding like that in many other areas? Another local native, black sage. This is not quite as showy in most people's opinion as the Cleveland sage or the white sage, but it does have that darker foliage, which can be nice in terms of contrast. The flower is white, as you can see, but it blooms a little bit, depending on your perspective, later in the season. So it will come into bloom like fall into winter, blooming in the garden right now when the other sages haven't started yet. So it's a great addition for habitat to extend the availability of those sage flowers for the pollinators and hummingbirds and butterflies throughout more of the year if you have room for it. Birds eat the seeds as well. Larval host plant for some butterflies, does smell amazing. So, you know, honestly, if I only have room for one sage, probably won't be this one. But if I have room for multiple and I'm really trying to maximize how much of the year I have flowers in my garden of the sages for the wildlife it supports, I will put a black sage in as well. They can get very large, especially if they get any extra irrigation. So might need to do some hacking back of them every once in a while. It's kind of unpredictable how large this species will get depending on the situation, but an important one to include in the list of things to consider if you have enough space to work with a number of sages. And then last sage we're going to talk about is not a native sage. This is a native sage from farther south in Mexico. It's Mexican bush sage. But this one, a couple of reasons why I'm including it. This one actually can take part shade and still do quite well, where all of the other ones need full sun. This also blooms later than most of the native sages, to late summer into fall, and will be used by our native pollinators. So I know this because I've had this in gardens where I'll kind of walk through the garden on a warm day and all of the other sages have done blooming for the season. And this will still be in full bloom. And I look at the flowers and there's all sorts of activity going on. If I do end up using this, oftentimes I'll use a dwarf selection called Santa Barbara Mexican bush sage. That will only get to be maybe knee high, a little bit taller with the flowers, still will get to be about 5 feet wide, but fits into a few different kinds of spaces where, again, a lot of the other taller sages maybe won't. It's a little bit different than the other sages in terms of it doesn't have as bushy of a structure. During part of the year, it will look like it, but over each season, the lower leaves start to fall. It starts to get what's called leggy looking, where the stems will be bare at the bottom. It doesn't look that great. And when that happens, it gets cut pretty much to the ground every year. And then new growth kind of starts immediately and comes back. So normally that happens in the winter. Again, all that maintenance information is in detail on the Inland Valley Garden Planner. So this is also another just example of really that right plant, right place, making sure you have room for your plants. Now, maybe it's worth it to this person, but it's so easy with these larger shrubs, if they get a little bit bigger than you're anticipating, although this one isn't particularly large for the species, and you see how like half the sidewalk or this walkway is lost here. Now, quite honestly, there's parts of my backyard where my partner and I don't mind brushing up against plants, and we just have informal mulch pathways. So there's some areas where we want to plant the plant, and some parts of the year, we do kind of need to almost walk through plants, and that's fine. We like a very kind of wild backyard, intimate association with our plants. That's totally cool. But if you're thinking about like your front yard up against the sidewalk, realize that if you have a situation like this, someone in a wheelchair or someone pushing a stroller just can't get by. So you definitely want to be more conscious of the sizes of your plants. And so since some of the shrubs have a range of the width that they will get, oftentimes, especially in front yards, near sidewalks, I encourage people to plant these a little bit further back in the landscape. And then some of the smaller perennial plants that we'll talk about later on are better for the edges, a little bit more predictable, a little bit easier to prune if they start to grow over, where here you just need to like cut straight down the side, and it would look terrible if you needed to prune back to the edge of this walkway. And then one more I really want to include, not truly a shrub, but because it's a large enough bunch grass, you can, if you want to, kind of use it as a shrub, one that contrasts with the forms and the shapes and the leaf shape of the other shrubs in a landscape. This is deer grass, local native plant, which is just absolutely gorgeous. These flower stalks, they stay very narrow. They don't get a big like billowy flower like some of the other ornamental grasses, which in a design sense I really like, because that means that they also don't need to be cut back to stay looking good when that's done. And in fact, after the seeds develop, goldfinches and other small seed-eating birds love these, and you'll see huge flocks of goldfinches sometimes like descend into the deer grass, and they'll climb up each stalk and peck out each little seed. Awesome to see. They're likely a host for skipper butterflies. It's known that very closely related ones are. They just haven't been directly observed on this particular species. Great in full sun. Really does want sun to look well. It'll grow in more shade, but the form won't be that nice. It'll be kind of floppy looking. If your parkway is at least 6 feet wide, which most people don't have, but some people have, great parkway plant. And so one important thing in terms of design for these, the plant itself, and usually if you read how wide it is, about 4 feet wide, but to let the flower stalks do their thing. This is earlier in the season, but you can see here how they're starting to like come down. The flower stalks from flower stalk to flower stalk without any pruning will be about 6 feet wide. And it's gorgeous, but you don't want to put it somewhere where it's, again, going over onto the sidewalk, and then you have to start cutting them back. Now, in a garden where it's surrounded by shrubs, you can crowd it a little bit closer in, because these flower stalks can interact nicely with the shrubs around it. It can all kind of grow together. And another thing I love about this as an ornamental grass is a lot of the ornamental grasses, to be kept looking good, you really need to cut them back really hard, almost to the ground every year. This one in most gardens, only once every 2 to 3 years. Very low maintenance. So I saw a few questions come in, I think. From Hui Wen, for the desert mallow, when you say cut back after the main bloom, all the way down, or just the flowering stem? So for that one, happens to be flowering stem plus a little bit more, because right underneath the flowering stem, the leaves start to have more stem in between them. So you cut it back to where it'll be bushy, not all the way to the ground. But for example, for the Mexican bush sage, you do cut it almost all the way to the ground. So that's why I'm not going to get to the maintenance for each plant, because we'll be here all day. Again, it's simple for most plants, but that's really where the value of that maintenance information on the Inland Valley Garden Planner comes in. So you can make sure you're going to do it the best way for the plant to respond. And then Sarah offered in that her cat loves to play in deer grass, loves to wrap front legs and paws around it. Interesting. Cool. Okay, so next, we're going to go down to the next lowest layer, which is the edges, those plants that would be good kind of near up against the sidewalk, along pathways, or also if you're working with smaller plants like in between your larger or medium-sized shrubs. So this is one of my all-around favorites for so many reasons. This is red buckwheat. So this is a littler relative of both that California buckwheat and that Santa Cruz Island buckwheat. This one is also from the Channel Islands, but does surprisingly well inland. Does extremely well on the coast, but in most cases does surprisingly well inland as well. Generally, it's a pretty good parkway plant. It's interesting. I would say especially a good parkway plant if there's not full blasting sun all day, and maybe there's a street tree. We have these in the parking lot at the Waterwise Community Center, near some kind of more medium water use trees that get watered about twice a month, and they do quite well there. In my front yard, where I'm watering closer to once a month, I had some of these near the asphalt driveway, afternoon sun, reflected heat. And on the west side, they don't do quite as well. On the east side of that same landscape, with that once a month water, they do very well. But they just really seem to thrive with that little bit of afternoon shelter. Now, in the backyard, where it's not that reflected heat like from the street or the driveway, they do better with very little water. So probably because it's from the islands, just might need a little bit more water if it's in that reflected heat situation. In between fruit trees, where it's getting a little bit more often water, that they do well as well. So I mentioned in the description for this workshop that I mentioned the plants on this list that do well near fruit trees. A lot of people grow fruit trees in their backyards. I have a whole section of my yard where fruit trees are the primary thing going on there. But in our backyards, oftentimes we want to get a lot out of our spaces, especially we have a smaller backyard and we're trying to grow a few fruit trees. And traditionally, what I've mostly seen is that underneath people's fruit trees, they're either just trying to keep the soil bare, which is not the best thing, or having wood chip mulch is great, but oftentimes it's just like wood chip mulch and people are trying to keep down the weeds. There's absolutely no reason why those other areas kind of underneath the fruit trees, in between the trees that would otherwise just be mulch or dirt, can't be garden areas as well. And so when we look at the water-wise plant palette, though, for a lot of our plants, that area would be a little bit too much water for watering for the fruit trees. And so just kind of mostly through trial and error over the years, I've developed this kind of core list of plants, many of which are California native plants, which don't need a lot of extra water. They're not going to be taking a lot of extra water from the soil if they're planted with the fruit trees, but it's not deleterious for them to get that water. And so I'll be mentioning some of those so that we can also have those areas be more like the garden. And then also in those areas, by combining some of these plants in around our fruit trees, in addition to pollinators, which are great to make sure we have around for our fruit trees when they come into bloom, a lot of these also attract other beneficial insects, which I haven't been getting into. There's only so much we can talk about on each plant, but a lot of these will also attract either like ladybugs or what are called parasitic wasps, which are many species of tiny, tiny wasps. They don't sting us. They're not like the ones that people are afraid of. Hard to even notice, but sometimes you'll see looks like a tiny dot just furiously flying around some of these plants when they're in bloom. A lot of those are ones where the adults of the species will rely on the nectar from some of these plants, but the larvae eat aphids or they'll eat scale that are some of our common pest insects on our fruit trees. So by having them nearby, not only beauty, but they're helping create this whole ecology that helps keep our gardens low maintenance and helps us in a very natural way that we don't even need to get involved with our pest problems. Doesn't mean that you won't ever have to do anything about aphids or scale on your fruit trees, but you will have less pest pressure. And I do see that. You can actually see evidence of that if you learn how to see like which ones were eaten by these insects, and there's a little like tiny little part of an aphid, dried out body left. It really does happen as soon as you plant these plants and they start to bloom. So enough of that tangent. But so for all those reasons, I'll mention these plants, which mostly they don't need as much water as fruit trees, but you can mix them in. So this is one that tends to work great in those zones. And it can take sun, but this can do very well inland in up to part shade. Flowers for a lot of the year, spring, summer, and into fall in many gardens. How much heat and sun it gets will determine how early it starts blooming. Pollinators and butterflies love the flowers. Larval host plant for butterflies, including some really beautiful blues and hair streaks. Birds will eat the seeds after they dry out and develop. This is one that will self-seed and spread a bit in most gardens, which is normally in a nice way. So it's not like it's a horrible weed. Oftentimes where it comes up, I will be perfectly happy to let it grow there. These are not super long-lived plants of the buckwheat. Sometimes like the individual plant will live 2, maybe 3 years, but because it self-seeds and because a lot of the seeds will drop closely nearby, for example, I have one where the original one I planted on the northeast corner of my front yard and the garden's maybe coming up on 2 years old, has died already, but it seeded a whole bunch of new ones around it, which, because they grow quickly, are almost full size. So I have more red buckwheat in that area, which is great for that area than I started with. So just a quick note. So if you see something small next to it where the leaf looks similar, that's a new one coming in on its way. You might decide to leave it. Here's a close-up of the really beautiful flowers. So I just personally am not the biggest fan of pink flowers, although I won't hesitate to use them if there's something else I like about the plant, or I like the form. But the complexity of these close-up is really quite beautiful. Another one of my favorite ones, especially for like along sidewalks, pathways. I just planted both a bunch of red buckwheat and a bunch of this along both sides of the sidewalk in my parents' front yard garden that gets full blasting afternoon sun in Van Nuys, California. It's been about 5 years since we planted it. It was time for some renovations for some of the smaller plants, and I'm excited to watch them grow in. This is Margarita Bop penstemon. This is so another penstemon, so a smaller relative of that tall showy penstemon we talked about. This one stays low. This is a number of them. Individual plants, normally about 2 feet wide, sometimes up to about 3 if they really like the soil and the conditions. And these are very showy as well. Can take full blasting sun to part shade. Good for parkways, along driveways, things like that. Spring to summer flowering. Hummingbirds and pollinators really like the flower. Larval host plant for a bunch of cool butterflies. Usually also can take some extra water and work pretty well in the sunnier spots in between fruit trees, but maybe still getting that same irrigation. Here it is in a pot. This is one that does work very well in a pot, especially if it gets some afternoon shade. Here it is close up, and it's hard. In person, the flowers go from purple to like usually this like iridescent blue. You can kind of see it better in the lower corner, and it's one that is really hard to capture with a photograph. It's just so beautiful in person. And sometimes these little tiny native iridescent green bees will also be inside of them. The whole thing together is just breathtaking. Here's another penstemon, another one of my favorites. This one is great in parkways. Loves that full blasting sun as long as it gets that occasional watering. This one is from the true desert. I've seen it growing in wild areas outside of Las Vegas, all the way to closer areas of the California desert, but does great in our inland gardens. So yeah, full sun. This one really does want full sun, can take maybe some shade. I think have seen it growing in some slot canyons in the desert. I normally use it in full sun though. This one tends to have a little bit more of a round shape than some of the other penstemons, especially with that cutback after it's done blooming for the year. It can stay pretty nice looking. Spring to summer, pretty long flowering season. Pollinators and especially hummingbirds love these flowers. Also good plant for some of the butterflies. And obviously very different contrasting flower color. This one's a little bit bigger than some of those other small plants. This is kind of somewhere between a large perennial and a small shrub. I plant this plant in almost every landscape I do because it has a long flowering season of these beautiful purple flowers. And as a nectar plant for adult butterflies, it really can't be beat. I mean, I've had these things, tiny little plants in the 1-gallon pots, and the butterflies are already showing up on them before they're even in the ground on planting day. They are just absolutely adored. And you will see a range of beautiful butterflies on them if you plant them. This is Delamina verbena. It is a selection of a species of native verbena, Verbena liliana, but the Delamina one is just a little bit smaller and has a great flower color. The flower color can kind of be variable, and this one has that really nice purple. Pollinators love the flowers too. In many gardens, it blooms almost year-round inland. It does definitely slow down in the midwinter. Full sun to part shade. If you have the opportunity to put it there, if you put it somewhere where it gets full sun most of the day and then a little afternoon shade, that's really its sweet spot. And that'll keep it blooming quite well into the season. Wants to be in a kind of, doesn't want to be in full part shade normally. It'll be a little sprawlier, a little bit less blooming if it does. If that's the only place you have to put it, not in deep shade, but some dappled shade, I'd still give it a shot. And it's okay with fruit trees as well. Normally, I would do that not like right underneath, but if there's a sunnier spot in between two fruit trees, good one to try. Here's a close-up of the flower. Here's in my front yard, absolutely beautiful. So question that came in, and I'm trying, because people are having questions on each of these plants sometimes as we go, trying to keep an eye on them a little bit more. From Christina, are these last three plants easy to grow from seed? For most gardeners, I would say no. Most native plants from seed, some of it can be done, but the timeline it takes to grow most of these plants from seed is like way different than if you're used to growing vegetables from seed. Like, I'll grow vegetables from seed, no problem at all. It takes so long, and conditions need to be right for most of the native plants that it's just not that viable for most people. To learn about which ones are worth it to grow from seed, and then some of them from cuttings, some of the organizations that specialize in teaching people exclusively about native plants do have some good propagation classes, especially the Theodore Payne Foundation will occasionally teach a propagation class, and they have a full-time seed program and person on site who does a really great propagation class every once in a while. So I would check that out. And I have seen gardens of people who have taken that class and planted most of their garden with stuff that they have propagated after that class. So that's great. But especially for these, the ones with the names, the cultivars, the Delamina and the Margarita Bop, those are ones that are propagated from cuttings. Again, not the easiest for a casual gardener to do because the conditions need to be just right. You can't really do those from seed. The species on some of them, yeah. But yeah, for most people, if you have a budget to buy the plant, you're going to do better. Yarrow, this one actually is one of the ones. It takes more time, but this one is kind of viable to start from seed as long as you have patience and keep things nice and moist. I did a design consultation through our program for someone who is a master gardener, who him and his daughter planted the yarrow in the landscape because they needed a bunch of it from seed, and it took a number of months to grow in, but it's getting ready for it to be transplanted into the garden soon. I've also had these in wildflower seed mixes where we toss it out into the yard, and most of the other wildflowers come and go, but after a year or so, this stuff is around. Yarrow is a great plant. It can take full blasting sun with a bit of extra irrigation all the way to part shade, where it's only will need that irrigation once a month, maybe once every 3 weeks in the summer, to shade where it doesn't need much irrigation. It is a local native, but normally locally around here, you'll see it like in the San Gabriel Mountains, where it's just one small one that gets kind of a little bit limp looking in the summer, like in the dappled shade of an oak tree, where in our gardens, we kind of want it to be this big flowering thing. So we do give it a bit of irrigation. I have it in my front yard where I'll water the whole landscape in the summer about once a month, but then like halfway in between that, I'll get out there with a hose and just kind of give a light watering to the yarrow to keep it looking a little bit better. It'll survive in the middle of summer with that infrequent once a month irrigation after it's established, but it won't look great the whole time. But it's a great plant, great habitat plant, so it's worth that little extra water to me. It's great in wet to dry transition areas or even areas that flood. This is one of my top plants that I will recommend people to use around bird baths, because bird baths should be cleaned ideally every day to keep them sanitary for the birds. And so the easiest thing to do is to tilt out that water from the bird bath and then blast it out with the hose and then refill it. And all that extra water just falling at the base into some yarrow keeps the yarrow very happy. Quick note, if you are someone who has bird baths in your yard in Southern California, there is an outbreak among certain birds of, I believe it's a salmonella, that some of the bird experts are worried could travel through bird baths. So keep your bird baths meticulously clean for now if you have them. And if you're not someone who is able to do that, it might be better to, at least for the next number of weeks, let them dry out. What my partner and I have started doing in our yard is we have in a spray bottle mixed in a 10% bleach, 90% water solution. And when we do our morning cleaning of the bird baths, we'll tilt them out, we'll spray that in some, and then we'll rinse it out and refill it. So that's something that rarely happens. I encourage people to generally have bird baths. First time I've heard of it happening, but it's something going on locally. Just want to make you aware of it. But yeah, great plant for at the base of bird baths or even areas that flood. This is excellent near or under fruit trees. In our backyard, a lot of our fruit trees have what started with just one yarrow plant planted underneath, just from a 4-inch pot, because you can sometimes find this in a 4-inch pot. And as long as you plant it like in the fall, make sure you keep it moist, it'll grow in pretty quickly. And this thing does spread, which is great underneath fruit trees, because where it would otherwise be like us battling weeds, now it's a bunch of yarrow, which is a powerhouse at attracting those beneficial insects that help with the pest insects, brings pollinators, butterflies, lovely. And you can just cut it to the ground even in a large patch with a string trimmer a couple of times a year to freshen it up, maybe just once even, and it grows right back. Really incredible plant, but it can spread pretty aggressively. So use it where you want to fill in open areas, and be prepared to pull it out where you don't want it. Like underneath our fruit trees, it's fine for it to ramble everywhere. In my front yard, where I have it along a little walkway area to get to the bird bath and underneath the bird bath, it grows nicely out into the other plants to where it doesn't leave a lot of bare soil. We don't have to look at just like the mulch anymore. But about once a year, I do get out there and I pull it out where it's starting to grow up underneath some of the other plants. I don't worry about digging out all the roots. I just kind of grab it and pull what'll come out. Some of the roots come out, a lot of it doesn't, and that's fine. But it's an incredible plant, but there's a little bit of maintenance that will usually come along with it after a few years. And birds will also eat the seed. So this is another shot of how I have it in my front yard. So this is the bird bath. You can see it's filled in. We started with just planting 4-inch pots. I think we did about 1.5 to 2 feet apart, and over a couple of years, it's fully grown in. And there's kind of like the area that I walk through to get it has the yarrow. And then every year or so, just kind of pull out some from underneath the other stuff. And you can see the buds starting to come in, which are followed by those beautiful white blooms. It's great. And this is another one where probably in the summer they get out here with the hose, and I would imagine give this corner a little extra irrigation. Great in like driveway corner areas, especially, your driveway, the size of your car, how you drive. If you have a driveway area that just every once in a while someone drives over the corner, this is a plant that won't kill, where a lot of other plants that, they'll get crushed and they won't recover. This, because of just kind of, it grows with the kind of underground roots kind of coming up where they come up. If it gets some foot traffic or an occasional wheel over it, it'll recover. And ladybugs really love to hang out in them. Ladybugs happen to be attractive to kind of fuzzy foliage, which this has. So I don't quite understand the science of that, but for whatever reason, seasonally, we just see a lot of ladybugs hanging out in the yarrow. And then one other one to mention is moonshine yarrow. So this is actually a Mediterranean, you could say, cousin to our California native yarrow. Our native yarrow is one that grows here, also grows in a number of other parts of the world. Moonshine yarrow is a light gray foliage, kind of sulfur yellow flowered yarrow that you can commonly find in local nurseries. This one is a Mediterranean native, but has many of the same, different look, but many of the same factors as our native yarrows, but a couple of different things. With kind of lower water, it tends to look a little bit perkier in full blasting sun throughout a little bit more of the year than the native yarrow. This one doesn't really like to grow in part shade, though. It really wants that full sun. It is great in your fruit trees in the sunnier areas. It can take that irrigation as well. I tend to go with the native yarrow near fruit trees, but if you really like that look and that color, that works. But this one, the main difference is that this one doesn't really spread. It stays like a lot of other perennials, just kind of its own like mini bush. You cut it back, clean it up some once a year. So if you have full sun, you want to have a yarrow, you like the color of this, and you don't want one that's going to spread, this is the moonshine is one to consider. Question from Karen. So will this moonshine yarrow not be good by the bird bath? If you're really doing that cleaning every day, which I think you should, that might be a little too much water for this one. This yarrow is one, the moonshine is one that that I'm not sure. It can take some extra water, but if it's that daily, it's not one that really grows in like areas that seasonally flood, like our native one. I would stick with our native one. But that species of our native one does have some other colors that it comes in. You can find it in pinks or reds or things like that. The moonshine is a different species. I know it's a little confusing maybe for some of you. So they're both yarrows, but they're a little bit different, come from a little bit different habitats. I do see some of you have been texting in or into the Q&A about some other kind of random plants we have not talked about yet. I'm going to have to hold those questions for the end, but then we can go through all of those that you've entered the questions about one by one and talk about them briefly as to whether or not they might do well in our area. Another one for full blasting sun that can also do okay in part shade is California fuchsia. Really nice plant. It's a local native. Really nice plant to help extend the flowering season in our gardens because this one blooms late summer into fall. And so a lot of the big color from the spring and summer will be done. And then these things with some of the buckwheats and some of the other plants will then be kind of coming in. Adored by hummingbirds and pollinators. So it's really important to extend the season for them as well. It spreads a little bit by the roots, and then also, depending on how long you leave the flowers on, can spread by the seed as well. So, but it is really easy to pull up where you don't want it because the roots and the stems are kind of brittle, so it pulls out really easily if it's starting to spread a little too much. If you don't want it to spread anymore, you do keep these vigorous in the garden by giving them a pretty hard cutback almost all the way to the ground once a year. And you normally do that in the late fall or early winter. So if you don't want it to spread when the flowers are done before it sets its seed on this one, you can do the cutback so it doesn't ever really fully set its seed. And is just absolutely, absolutely beautiful. There's a few different cultivars that sometimes the specialty native nurseries will have, with some of them stay a little bit lower, some of them get a little taller, so you can see what they have and make your choices from there. This is one that's great in parkway kind of spaces as well, because it can take that sun and reflected heat. Here you can see one that they need to do a little bit of trimming to keep this path open. It probably flops over and they trim it back, but still, lovely little spot of color in a pretty difficult area to garden in. Another really great one for parkways, full blasting sun areas. This one is a true desert plant, not from California, but more of a southwestern plant, red yucca. One of the great things about it is that it's a soft leaf without a point like most of our true yuccas do have. This is called red yucca, but it's not botanically a true yucca. Basically, the way I think about it is it converts heat into flowers. Full blasting sun gets these flowers, and there'll be more later in the season. In a full sun reflected heat area will be most of the warm season once the plants are established and really going. Enjoyed by hummingbirds and no spines. Lovely. And then on the smaller one that's great for edges situations like this, full sun to also part shade, good in between fruit trees, and more regular irrigated to drier transition zones, is Mexican daisy or Santa Barbara daisy, which grows from Baja California down into, I believe, some other parts of Mexico, and does this for a lot of the year. And just a lovely little plant that is also very good at attracting some of those tiny beneficial insects that will also help us with our pest insects in the garden. You can see the flowers close up. The flowers age and kind of change colors as they go. And then also wanted to mention a real utility plant in the garden and sometimes otherwise difficult places, or also used for meadows or other effects. This green here is Berkeley sedge, also closely related and sometimes even mixed up in the nurseries. They're so closely related to a plant called European gray sedge. Ultimately, at the end of the day, they're pretty much used interchangeably. The Berkeley sedge is technically a California native. The European gray sedge is native to Europe, but even some of the mostly native plant nurseries are not quite sure which of them they're growing. I mean, it all used to be confused. And then some grad student realized there were two different species and made everyone even more confused. Great, useful plant for, this is something that in kind of shady areas where nothing else seems to want to grow, this is a plant that will grow. Super tough. Part shade to shade inland. It can take full sun with some extra water, especially if it gets some afternoon shade. It's great in northern facing areas that, shady a lot of the year and then full blasting sun in summer, no problem. Great in areas that flood seasonally or part, they'll like flood after a rain event and then, or get really wet for a few days and then drain out. Great there. Does support skipper butterflies. And it's just kind of a simple green thing. Depending on how often you cut it back and the soil conditions, sometimes it'll stay quite small like this. More often inland, it will get larger like this. This is another one that tends to get a little bit bigger inland than the nursery catalogs say. And so the more I've planted this over the years, I've planted it kind of farther and farther apart. So these days I'll plant it at least 18 inches apart from each other, if not 2 feet, a single specimen of one. Sometimes they'll get up to 3 feet wide. I wouldn't assume that, but up to 2 feet wide, at least 18 inches in inland heat, especially if it gets a decent amount of sun. If it's really shady, a lot of root competition from an established tree, maybe they won't get quite as big, but I plant them at least 18 inches apart. So this is actually my parents' backyard in Van Nuys, California, where we set up a simple Mediterranean meadow using this as the base plant. It is full sun overhead, but the house is kind of blocking the last of the afternoon sun. So it does get a little bit of shelter. And then in part of the yard, it's pretty narrow. So it's not full blasting sun, like sun up to sundown in the summer. And then I like to use some of these small grasses intermixed with other flowering accents. So there's other plants that kind of flower and kind of come and go visually throughout the year, and some other grasses. If you plant it in a little too much sun, it'll survive. It'll just kind of turn yellow throughout most of the year, where it's a little too hot for it. So it really stays that nice green with at least some afternoon shade inland. And like along the coast, you can probably do full sun, no problem. And another one to mix in terms of considering those low ground covers, this is blue finger, sometimes referred to as blue chalk sticks. And this is a succulent, not native, but very useful. So this is a mostly native front yard garden, but for something that's going to be clean, very simple to maintain, like along a sidewalk with some visual contrast, this sometimes is pretty useful. Can take full blasting sun to part shade. So especially if you have an area of a garden where you want the same plant and it runs in between the two, could be one to consider. Something that's easy to maintain and then just trim to the edge where it'll stay looking clean along a driveway, something to consider. And so we're very quickly going to go through our last categories and then make sure we have some time to wrap up. Just wanted to mention some of these plants that'll work for hedges. And we've talked about most of these plants already. So Coyote Brush that we talked about already, the kind of just green shrub with little flowers, good for habitat. You can use it as a hedge. If you're going to use it as a hedge, there's a hybrid dwarf version called Centennial, which is what's used here at the LA County Natural History Museum. That's worth trying. The main species itself, Coyote Brush, is going to want to be a larger hedge. It'd take a lot of work and be kind of difficult to keep it this small. California coffeeberry makes a great hedge. Usually when it's used as a low hedge, makes an incredible foundation planting on the north side of the house or in full sun. Usually one of the dwarf cultivars, Eve Case is the dwarf one that I normally use for something like this that's going to stay below the window, would be what you would use, or the species for like a full-sized hedge. So here's a very simple front yard. This is Western Meadow Sedge, which we'll talk about a little bit later, with Eve Case coffeeberry. Kind of conventional landscape design, but some great habitat supporting low water plants for it. Catalina Cherry, that tall island cousin of our native cherry we talked about, If you need a 20-foot tall hedge, 25-foot tall hedge, here you go. I'm using 3 of these that I'll need to do a lot of pruning to keep narrower in our yard to provide a little bit of separation from our neighbor's backyard along the edge of our property. And Toyon, this is kind of a younger hedge. These will be taller over time, but it can take some pruning. Toyon is great as a hedge, 5, 6, 8 feet apart, probably 6 to 8 feet apart. Incredible habitat hedge. Can also take some pruning, but is going to want to be on the larger side. So my habitat hedge in the backyard, the tall one, goes from that Catalina Cherry. We have 3 of them. And then next to it, as it's starting to get a little bit lower, we have a Toyon. That Howard McMinn manzanita we talked about works just great as a medium-sized hedge. Can take some pruning. And then also for a low hedge in like a Mediterranean garden, dwarf myrtle is one we haven't talked about. Not a whole lot of complexity to it. It's a kind of small, just small leafed, so it takes hedging very well, shrub, which is pretty easy to keep as either an informal or a more formal, like 3 to 4 foot tall hedge. And then another non-native one, but one that's commonly used because it flowers a lot of the year in full sun, is Little John bottlebrush, which hummingbirds and some pollinators like. This is a young one. It'll be would be kept at least to the top of the brick here. And then same picture you saw before, I am a fan of using just deer grass as a hedge. You don't often see a grass hedge around here, but it can look absolutely beautiful. And so then one of our last 2 categories that we will look at, we've talked again about some of these plants before, but we'll mix in a few. For that north side of houses, garages, those areas that are in a lot of shade a lot of the year, and then when that sun is high in midsummer, full blasting sun. All of these will also grow well in the shade. So we've talked about some of those shrubs that work, but a ground cover that I really like to grow in, it's right underneath the window that I'm sitting at right now on the north side of my house. It's California strawberry. This is one of the 2 parents. The strawberries that we eat are actually usually a hybrid between a European strawberry and this native woodland strawberry. These native wild ones strawberries can taste very sweet, but they're very, very small. The birds will eat most of them. They love them. But if you can get one every once in a while, they're delicious often. They can take a wetter to drier transition area. On the north side of the house in shade, they really need surprisingly little water for how lush they look. They will fill in. So works great in an area like this. You see they do creep. Easy to take care of. You just have to cut them back every once in a while. But they also will just kind of fill in all the open area in between larger shrubs, which is pretty cool. And they get nice little white flowers, and then the birds will eat most of the fruit. They're great underneath the canopy of a fruit tree as well, just to kind of mix up the ground cover if you're working with yarrow and other stuff. Toyon, we mentioned, can take that north side, that shade, quite well. And you can see in the background there's some of that strawberry. Native heuchera species. So heuchera is also called coral bells. There's many different heucheras. Some aren't native and take a lot more water. Some are native, and if they're in shade, need less water. So the ones I particularly like are Maxima. That's my favorite. That's from the Channel Islands, and it gets these very kind of more complex than most of the heucheras, like white to, I don't know, pinkish, but not quite pink flowers. And then Wendy and Rosada have more of a pink to almost reddish flower. They truly need shade inland. You can get away with more sun closer to the coast. They'll burn with too much sun inland. I keep them on the north side of my house, pretty close to the house. I have one that's a little bit farther away from the house, and it does get kind of funky, kind of burned foliage midsummer. I pull them off, and then they look amazing in the spring. So it's worth it to me. But you really want to keep them pretty close to the north side of the house if they don't have additional shade, or like they're great underneath an oak tree, great underneath fruit trees. So here's a close-up of that Heuchera maxima or island alum root. This one, the pink one, is Wendy. This is growing at the base of a mulberry tree. So in the shade of that fruit tree, you can take that extra irrigation. Another great one on that north side, which can also take some sun, is this one here on the right, the bunch grass, very ornamental. This is California fescue. Ornamental bunch grass can take dry or shade. and wet and a little bit more sun. So it's really beautiful. Nice blue color foliage. Fragrant pitcher sage doesn't have the cleanest form, but it is kind of an interesting mounding form. But it has an amazing smell. It can take full sun to full shade. So in areas where it's going to transition between the two, this is a shrub that will not have any problem with that. Beautiful bell-shaped flowers in late winter and spring that the hummingbirds love. So you can see that. I have it in my front yard, and the sprawling form by itself isn't a showstopper with the form, but the fuzz on the leaves, that's the one that I showed earlier that was almost glowing, the flowers seasonally, and then that form as a contrast to more structural shrubs works well. Amazing smell. This is one that on a hot day in the summer in the sun with the screen door open, you just, every time you walk in and out of my house, you smell this incredible heady smell. And then have a couple, actually have two more little sections, but they're quick, and then we will be wrapping up on time and then answering final questions. So at this point in time, I'll probably, to make sure we get through all of these plants, it's really hard to pace myself with all the information I want to share, but to make sure we get through the plants, I'll probably hold the questions till the end, and then I'll make sure that I get to everything. So in and amongst all of that, you're starting to build this complex garden. Some people will want a couple of more sculptural shaped accents, like where just one of them, or maybe three of them spaced pretty far apart, will kind of have a visual aspect that'll make things pop. So I call them sculptural accents, or sometimes even as a group. So sometimes I'll use deergrass for that sculptural shape. We've talked about deergrass already a couple of times. Works almost anywhere. So this is a design that I did where there was this existing tree, and we wanted something that was going to be elegant, kind of sculptural as the background. We just did deergrass. And then there's just like, in sunnier areas, there'll be like one sage and one buckwheat. Here's just one kind of at the highest point on a bit of a mound, catching that light with the flowers. It's a young one. It'll get bigger. Pink mullygrass can also be used the same way. This is a Texas relative of our deergrass. A little bit more maintenance. It doesn't look as good for as much of the year, but some people really love it for that beautiful fall bloom. Aloes are easy to work in, and our aloes and agaves, a lot of these succulents, will even mix quite well with our California native landscapes. Sometimes people like to mix in a few of these succulents to just get that sculptural form as a contrast to the more kind of shrubby and perennial forms in a native garden. Lots of different aloes work well as visual accents. Most of them will grow into sun or part shade. Some like more sun, so you just research whichever aloe. And a cool habitat thing about aloes, even though they're not a native plant, is that most of them bloom in the winter, where the hummingbirds could use some extra nectar sources. And so you'll see them on the aloes. Agaves as well, very similar horticulturally in the average garden to aloes, at least for the ones that are sold in the local nurseries. Easy sculptural plants, but for both of them, but especially some of the agaves get huge, and sometimes they're put in areas where they either don't have enough room or the spines on them will become very dangerous. So research the one you're planting, make sure you have enough room. This one right along the walk right here happens to be foxtail agave. It's one of the few without any spines, so that works just fine there. And then we'll talk about just a couple of vines. This is California grape. Lovely, very large vine that can cover a whole trellis, the side of a whole house. It doesn't need a lot of water, but it can also take as much water as it will get. It can grow in the shade. It's crazy vigorous. So like one vine can get to be like 40 feet long easily. It does get tasty, tiny grapes on it that the birds love, but they can also attract ants. So like I wouldn't want it right next to my house, but we have one kind of farther at the bottom of our backyard because it's a great habitat plant. It does drop all of its leaves in winter and generally needs significant pruning each year because it just puts on so much growth, but a lot of people think it's worth it. Here's one actually growing in a pot, just keeping it small over one area. There is a hybrid naturally occurred and was found in Northern California between a European wine grape and our native grape that turns bright red in the fall before it drops its leaves, called Rogers Red. That's the one I have in my yard. Absolutely gorgeous. And then the other one I'll mention is blood red trumpet vine. This is actually a medium water requiring vine, not really low. On the coast, it can be pretty low, but there's not a lot of big, vigorous evergreen vines available to us that are truly low water. This one might be worth it if you need a big evergreen vine because it gets these red, beautiful trumpet flowers a lot of the year that are appreciated by hummingbirds. So it does contribute to habitat. And then finally, some simple turf replacement options. This in the background is Western meadow sedge. If you want kind of a very fast growing native-ish meadow, this is the one that I really recommend for our inland areas. I have some in my yard. We're doing some experiments with it, really trying to figure out the exact irrigation it takes to stay looking green and nice in full sun, but without using any extra water, going on at the Waterwise Community Center. And when we figure that out, we will be letting everybody know. We're just kind of in our first year of growing it in. Way less water for sure than traditional turf, especially like in my yard. I'm okay with it. If you let it go a little bit dry, it'll kind of turn golden in the summer. So most of the summer, even I'm watering it like every other week in my backyard and once a week in the hottest parts of the summer. And it's doing well. Cut back once or twice a year with just like a string trimmer, pretty easy. It can spread aggressively into the other parts of your yard. So you're either going to want to have it somewhere where it can spread or put in some sort of root barrier. And it's good near fruit trees. It doesn't need a ton of water, but you'll never overwater this. Buffalo grass is another southwestern native, not truly from California, which looks similar to Bermuda grass lawn, but grows slower, lower water than traditional turf. And you can leave it taller like a meadow or mow it, usually only once a month to keep it more like a true turf. Does go dormant and turn kind of golden or beige in the coldest parts of the winter. But here it is with that kind of wintry look, so not unattractive. As often, if you're maintaining it informally, a little bit patchier, but still you want a little spot for the dog or for the kids to run around on. This is just fine with a much lower water approach. And then finally, yarrow. We've talked about it, but used as a whole kind of turf replacement can be very beautiful, less water than traditional turf. Not going to be one for a ton of foot traffic, but occasional, like if there's a path you don't need to walk down very often. And you can either mow it pretty consistently to just keep it low, like as close to a turf as possible, or let it flower like this, and then just mow it to clean it up afterwards. And then you get all of that great pollinator and butterfly action. So what I'm going to do is just quickly walk you through. We don't have the time to do it because it's basically at the end, but also just a few notes on some. If you have like a slope or want some very simple large scale ground covers, here's some that you can refer to if you download the PDF of all of the slides. And just a quick note, since we're talking about plants, never plant invasive plants. So there's a few that are particularly bad in our region. This is one that's very common. I can't believe people are still putting it in new landscapes. It is beautiful, but this fountain grass spreads to wild areas. It outcompetes because it grows so quickly native plants and is very flammable when it dries out in the summer. So it actually can increase the chances of an area catching on fire. Don't plant fountain grass. Don't let your friends plant fountain grass. Mexican feathergrass is also invasive. It's not as big of a problem in the wild near us than some of the other grasses, but still not to be encouraged. There's plenty of great non-invasive alternatives. And pampas grass, really a huge problem on the coast. Again, not as bad near us, but again, there's way better things to plant. So avoid planting those. So for finding these plants, and then we're just about ready to wrap up, what you're going to want to do is find places that specialize in these plants. You're really not going to find them at like Home Depot or just any generic nursery. Some of them are getting better. Always call and ask because that's how you get demand. But if you download the presentation, here are some of my favorite local Inland Empire going into kind of the valley areas and then even into LA sources. And then the main thing I recommend is at cbwcd.org/presentations, where I typed into the chat at the beginning, where you can download the presentation. I have a whole local landscape suppliers list, including which nurseries that are kind of specialty nurseries, what they grow, as well as sources for other landscape supplies. And so I'm going to skip ahead a few slides. I had a few other notes about selecting plants and things like that there just wasn't time to cover, but wasn't really the meat of the presentation. But all of those are covered in much more detail in our other presentations that we have in our other workshops. So all of these workshops currently on here and more are available as recordings of past workshops that we've given, just like this, on our YouTube channel at cbwcd.org/YouTube. And then we're teaching a lot of them throughout the next 6 months and year online, just like this. So you can check out that schedule at cbwcd.org/waterwise workshops. So for example, now that we've talked about plants, if you're just getting started, check out Landscape Transformation Basics. We have Removing Your Lawn the Right Way, give you all the tips and tricks on that. And then for irrigation, retrofitting lawn sprinklers for waterwise and California native gardens. Then we have a whole series on different aspects of garden design, and then how to actually do it. Installation and establishment of these gardens, that choosing, purchasing, and planting the plants. So how do you choose the best plant at the nursery? Make sure you're selecting a good, healthy plant. Top tips for planting plants in the ground. A lot of people don't quite have that down yet. Set your plants up for success. And then pruning and maintenance after they're in the ground. And so with that, I think I'm going to skip ahead to the last slide. And what I'm going to do as I start to answer the questions is I am going to put up just a very brief closing poll, because it's super important to me to know if this workshop was useful to you. I want to make sure that between this and our other workshops, we're really giving people the information that they are looking for. Beyond the few answers in the poll, please let me know in the chat. Was there anything particular in this workshop that you found particularly useful that you'll use? Or if there's anything that wasn't clear or anything I didn't cover that you really feel like you need or were expecting, please let me know as well, because we're always developing additional resources for people. And the feedback we get on the chat at the ends of these workshops is really important for the next time we teach this workshop or additional workshops or online resources that we will develop for you. So with that, as people are answering these, I want to say thank you very much for joining us today, spending a good chunk of your Saturday morning learning about these favorite plants for our inland gardens. Up here, we have most of the links that I mentioned during the workshop. And I will then start answering all of the questions that have come in. And I'll stay until we get through as many questions as we need to. So if you have new questions, feel free to send them in. Okay. So from Heather, is Heather still with us? I want to make sure for some of these very specific questions have it. Would you recommend Melaleuca nesophylla for a landscape tree? So the plant itself will have no problem growing, especially for you in Ventura. But what I have found in my experience with it, which is not extensive, I've only planted it and taken care of it a few times. It really wants to be more of a shrub, kind of becomes a floppy shrub. Like you can prune it up to expose the bark, but it's kind of a shrubbier thing than like a traditional like tree, at least as it grows in our local area. Also had a question about Soya heterophylla. I am actually not familiar with it. I don't believe so. I'm going to quickly look that up. And see what the Australian bluebell creeper. I think this might be one that's not really grown inland that much and probably grows more coastal. So I actually don't have any experience with it. However, you may have come across it the first thing that comes up is a listing from San Marcos Growers, which is a really good quality wholesale nursery in Santa Barbara. So you might check out, if you haven't already, their profile on it. They would probably have pretty good information about whether or not it would work in Ventura, kind of thinking that Santa Barbara is a pretty similar coastal climate. Okay, from Esther Martinez, does Texas mountain laurel do well in our area of Chino? Good question. In my experience, kind of problematic in our local inland valley areas. Texas mountain laurel is a beautiful plant that by just kind of knowing where it comes from, and it seems like it would grow well around here, but you don't really see it around here. And I believe that it's because it doesn't grow, actually grows very slowly around here. And it's kind of tough to grow around here. And I'm not quite sure why, but I know just as I've researched plants over the years and talked to other experienced gardeners that, that there's reasons why you don't normally find it around here. Okay, so Margaret asked, when I was showing the picture in my parents' backyard, what was the orange flower? There were a couple of orange reddish flowers mixed in with the sedge. One was an orange cultivar of Australian kangaroo paw, and the other one was a red to orange flowering red hot poker. So those are example as an Australian perennial and a South African perennial. So both Mediterranean climate plants that work well with that. They don't quite make it into my top recommended plants, but are ones that in that particular garden for the specific things that my mom really was looking for have worked out well. From Karen, will a blue finger fill in spaces around other succulents? Absolutely. Yes, it will. It doesn't spread indefinitely. It does spread slowly, but it's easy to propagate from cutting. So if you have some and you want it to kind of spread more into other areas, you can just kind of take a few cuttings and plop it into the ground and it'll kind of spread out there too. From Ruth Ann, what was the dwarf coyote brush variety? That one is called Centennial, is the variety. So yeah, if you want to keep a coyote brush shrub that small, it's Centennial is not always the easiest one to find, but it is worth it. The biggest thing that I've seen difference in terms of like the actual like landscape look of the coyote brush hedges that I've seen is that the normal species native coyote brush wants to be like a at least 6, 8, maybe 10 foot tall shrub or hedge, and you can keep it smaller with some pruning, but it generally doesn't stay like really green, like right down to the base of the plant. And so up to like maybe shin high on the full species, it'll be a little bit more sparse in the foliage, which isn't a problem really for a 6-foot hedge with shrubs growing in front of it. But for a really little one, you want it to stay green as far down as possible. And that hedge with the Centennial seems to be a little bit better at doing that. So what would work best in a similar shady strip on the side of a house that's only a few inches wide? Yeah, we get these really weird situations of these like almost impossible to grow in areas of soil that are just a few inches wide. Anything I can think of will flop kind of, if it's really just a few inches, will flop out onto the walk that's next to it. So like the strawberry might be able to grow, especially if you put like one like drip line or soaker hose in there, but it's immediately going to grow out onto the path all the time. Like if you try to get yarrow established, again, it'd grow right out onto the path. I could try to give you a better idea if you type back in, like, is that 2 inches, 4 inches, 6 inches? Because if it's 6 inches versus like 12 inches, that's going to be a different amount of flexibility. So it'll be tough to find anything that's really going to thrive there. But if you really have a better estimate of how many inches it is, I can really try to help you kind of narrow it down if you want to type that back into the Q&A, and I'll get back around to it. For shade plants, if they're under fruit trees, they would lose shade in the winter. Is that a problem? So good question. So yeah, some fruit trees are deciduous, some fruit trees are evergreen. For all of those ones that I recommended for the winter, because the sun in the winter is less intense, those are all the ones I mentioned that I said are decent with fruit trees are totally adapted to take that full sun at the times of year when there's no leaves on the tree. And then the tree is leafed back out by the time it would need that shelter. Good question. Okay, so from Christine, I'd appreciate your recommendation for a vine to grow against a south-facing black wall that can get extremely hot in the summer. Preferable evergreen with flowers to attract butterflies or bees, regular drip system in place for Mediterranean plants. So for that, if you can set up for most vines, you're gonna want to set up a trellis. And especially if you want something that's gonna have flowers, you're looking at something that's gonna need a trellis. If you have a block wall, there are some great like concrete anchor bolts and things like that on the market where instead of needing to like set up or like buy like trellis material to go all the way across, you can bolt into the concrete and then do some research or work with someone who's really handy, but run wires in between and tension them would be what I would personally do if I had that situation, because then you can rely on all of that structure from the block wall. There'll still be some cost involved, but it'll be way more long lasting and way better looking and way cheaper than if you were trying to like set up a redwood trellis or something all the way across it. If you do something like that, I would go for that blood red trumpet vine as kind of my go-to for sure. If you are needing something that sticks to that block wall, I am not going to have anything for you that gets the flowers and contributes to habitat. But like what I ended up doing in my parents' backyard, surrounded by a cinder block wall, same thing is we did creeping fig, which will stick to the block wall, just turn it green over time. There's some maintenance. You need to keep it sheared. It can grow into other plants if you don't do the maintenance on it, and it's pretty aggressive, but it does just stick to, no trellis, covers the block wall against like the three sides of their yard. Because their block wall does get really hot and reflected heat in the summer as well, it hasn't totally grown in evenly yet, but it's getting there. And it's I tell most people if they're going to do that creeping fig on the block wall to make sure that they maintain it and keep it cut at the top, because if not, it'll creep into the neighbor's yard and keep going, which they might not like. But for example, in my parents' yard, all the neighbors have the same ugly block wall. So as it started to creep into some of the neighbors, they love having it starting to creep into their yards, and it can be quite tough. But yeah, for your overall, if you could put in a trellis, go with that blood red trumpet vine. Okay, from Christina. Any ideas of small shrubs and edging plants to grow under trees, golden medallion and ash tree, that drop trash all year round? And is California strawberry okay to plant under citrus fruit trees? Finally, are agaves the plant that die after blooming? Okay, bunch of good questions. Easy one. California strawberry okay under citrus fruit? Absolutely. Have that situation in my yard. They love life down there. Are agaves the plant that die after blooming? Yes, the vast majority of agaves will bloom once after many years, and then they will die. But often by the time they do that, they've set off little offsets or pups that are many kind of the same thing. And so not for all, but for a lot of species of agaves, by the time that that one dies, you can cut that out, and then you'll have multiple little new ones that you can replant in the same area or even move some of the other ones around. Small shrubs and edging plants to grow well under trees that drop trash year round. That's always a tough situation, because you want plants that are going to kind of not need to be raked out all of the time. So if there is shade underneath, depending on the size of it, what I would like to normally do is I would have wood chip mulch, and then I just kind of spot the plants here or there, so there's stuff to look at. But if it's wall-to-wall plants, then all of that leaf litter you're going to see. So that Berkeley sedge is one that I will often use, kind of spotted here or there underneath a tree. We have those underneath a sycamore that drops a lot of leaves in our demonstration garden. Also using that yarrow, not as a total like turf cover, but if you spot maybe that that Berkeley sedge here and there and that yarrow here and there, which will give a little bit of flowering even in the shade, not as much as in the sun, but you'll get some. Those are ones to kind of go with. And then also other ones that can sometimes take those situations if they're in the more like dappled shade areas, not in total complete shade, then some of the aloe plants as well, depending on the size of the leaves, you might need to clean them out every once in a while, but like that coral aloe can sometimes do okay. And then, yeah, I would maybe start there, but the main thing you want to do is kind of think about the form and think, is it usually kind of either smaller plants where you can just rake the stuff across, dotted here or there, or if it's a shrub, something with a looser form. The denser the shrub is, the more it'll just like hold all of that leaf litter drop on top of it. The kind of looser things can sometimes let some of it fall through. Like even the fragrant pitcher sage is one that sometimes I'll use underneath other trees as well. Okay, so, okay, back from Austin, 3 inches. 3 inches in shade, I might consider a shady succulent garden, as long as there's decent drainage or there's not a lot of water that accumulates and floods in that area. Some of the really small succulents, like the Echeverias, Echeveria, which like you can find, the quality of the ones at the big box stores, even though they have them, are really bad. But even something like Armstrong or any other independent nursery that has decent succulents, you can ask them for something like really small. You can usually buy them in a 4-inch pot, which you can still get into fitting in a 3-inch area, and look for ones that stay small. As long as they will stay about 4 inches and you're not too worried about people like stepping on it, then that might be where I would probably go with is some like little tiny succulents. 3 inches is really tough. The other thing you might do is, and this is honestly probably what I would do, is if it's a walkway and then really just 3 inches, if I have good planting space on the other side of it, I would honestly give up on trying to garden in 3 inches. I would just put like some nice looking, maybe like small, like river rock gravel that looks nice into that spot, and maybe 2 or 3 succulents to see if they live and if they don't get stepped on, and call it a day. If it's, you have very little planting space and you're trying to maximize it, that gets kind of tough. But yeah, 3 inches is real tough. Okay, from Sherry, what can we plant in a small triangle shaped space between driveway and walkway, about 3 feet plus long and from about 2 feet down to inches wide? So in that 3-foot area, you might, so I think you have a couple of early morning sun, then shade. I think you have a couple of ways you can go. In the 3-foot wide space, like any of those penstemons that we talked about, the smaller ones, could work. Like I might go with the Margarita Bop penstemon. And then as it gets down to smaller, I might start to work with some smaller succulents in some of that area. There's just so many to choose from, but normally the sizes are kind of predictable when you read about them. And yeah, that might be, because down to 2 inches is kind of tough. The other thing you can do is just go with like a simple concept, like you're going to turn it into a little spot of meadow and plant the Western meadow sedge. But I'm not sure if that would really do anything for you. You might want to get a little flowering in. So maybe the smaller penstemon and then some smaller succulents. And then if you want to try to gain some height out of it as it starts to get smaller, if you're not in an area where you'd worry about the pots disappearing, you might have like some smaller succulents in the ground and then a couple of pots of different sizes that then have maybe just succulents again, but some slightly larger stuff, single specimen in a pot, maybe even some of the succulents that would then trail over the edge of the pot going down, and then that base layer to try to build as much depth as you can in a small little planter.
Okay, let's see. We are kind of getting to the end. I think that is it. I'm just going, yep, I think we've covered all of the questions. So thank you very much for joining us. So for those of you who want to refer to it, like right now, as soon as this workshop is over, I'm going to save out these slides as a PDF and get that up online. And then again, because I am leaving town, it'll be probably about a week until this recording is then posted up on YouTube, because that takes a little time to process. So I will say goodbye now. Thank you very much for joining us today, and I'll hang out just in case there's some last questions as people sign out. But other than that, have a good rest of your weekend, everybody, and hope to connect with you in future workshops and then one day in person at the Waterwise Community Center once we are able to get our facility back open. Bye, everybody.